He had 10 minutes before the most important interview of his life, and he used every single one of them to save a stranger. A luxury SUV, a rain-soaked highway, a woman trapped underwater with 60 seconds of air left in her lungs. Mason Rourke didn't hesitate. He dove in. He pulled her out. And then he watched his future disappear. What he didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the woman he saved was being hunted. And the moment he touched that car, he became the only person standing between her and the people who wanted her dead. Go. If stories like this one stay with you long after the screen goes dark, stories about ordinary people forced into extraordinary moments, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain had been coming down since before dawn, the kind of slow, heavy rain that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives and settles in like it owns the place. By 7:15 in the morning, Route 9 along the Harwich coastline was slick and gray, the drainage channels running fast with brown water, the guardrails beaded with moisture that caught no light at all. Mason Rourke drove with both hands on the wheel, which was not something most people noticed, but which said a great deal about him. His truck was 11 years old, a dark blue Silverado with a cracked dashboard mount and a pine-shaped air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything. The passenger seat held a manila folder, a clean button-down shirt still in its dry cleaning bag, and a travel mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere around mile 4. He'd been up since 5. Ellie had woken him at 4:30 with a nightmare she couldn't quite describe. Something about water, she said, and Mason had sat on the edge of her bed until she drifted back off, one small hand loosely holding 2 of his fingers. He'd showered after that, standing in the steam longer than he should have, trying to settle something in his chest that didn't have a name. Today mattered. He knew it. He'd known it for 3 weeks since the email arrived from Aurelia Systems confirming a final round interview for Director of Emergency Operations. He'd read it 4 times before forwarding it to nobody because there was nobody to forward it to. He'd told Ellie that morning over cereal. She'd asked why he was wearing a tie, and he'd said he had a meeting with some important people. And she'd looked at him with her mother's eyes and said, "You look weird in ties, Daddy." He did. He knew that too. Mason was 37 years old, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age. Not soft, not beaten, but weathered in the specific way that comes from years of physical work, followed by years of emotional labor that doesn't show up on the body but shows up everywhere else. His hands were calloused and slightly oversized for his frame. There was a faint scar along his left jaw from something he rarely thought about anymore. His haircut was 2 weeks overdue, and he'd noticed this morning that the gray at his temples had expanded its territory since the last time he'd paid attention. The tie was burgundy. He'd bought it for his wife's funeral 5 years ago and hadn't worn it since. He was 10 minutes out from the Aurelia Systems campus when the SUV appeared in his rear-view mirror. It was moving wrong. Not fast. That was the first thing Mason noticed. It wasn't speeding. It was drifting. A black Escalade, late model, one of those vehicles that announces itself as belonging to someone with money and an assistant who handles the scheduling. It came up behind him and then began sliding right, then correcting hard left, then sliding again, the rear end fishtailing slightly on the wet pavement. Mason tracked it for 2 full seconds before pulling his foot off the accelerator. Blowout, he thought first. Then, medical event. Then he saw the vehicle's speed drop suddenly, completely wrong. Not like a brake being applied, but like the brake had become irrelevant. He said something under his breath that wasn't a word. The Escalade crossed the shoulder at maybe 40 miles an hour, clipped the guardrail, and went through it in a burst of orange rust and bent steel. For one strange, suspended moment, it seemed to hang. Then it dropped 8 feet into the drainage channel below, and hit the water hood first with a sound Mason felt in his back teeth. He had already stopped. He was already out of the truck. Later, he would not be able to tell you exactly what decision he made, because there was no decision. There was the crash. There was the water. And then there was Mason Rourke running across wet gravel toward the edge of the channel, shrugging off his jacket mid-stride, leaving the jacket somewhere on the ground without knowing he'd done it. The channel was running harder than it looked. The water was cold. Cold enough that the first contact was a full-body shock that hit him like a door slamming shut. He went under for a moment, found his footing on the rocky bed, and pushed toward the vehicle. The Escalade had settled nose down at a steep angle, the tail end still above water, rear windows just at the surface. Mason could see through the glass, barely. Dark interior, steam rising, the white bloom of a deployed airbag. There was someone inside. Front seat. Not moving right. He grabbed the rear door handle. Locked. He grabbed it again and pulled with both hands, planting his feet against the side panel, and it held. Mason reached into his back pocket, produced a window punch. He carried one on his keychain, had for years, the habit left over from a previous life, and hit the rear window at the lower corner. The glass spiderwebbed and fell inward in chunks. He cleared the edge with his forearm, felt it cut him somewhere, didn't stop. Inside was worse than it looked from outside. The driver's airbag had deployed, but the seat had collapsed partially forward, pinning the occupant in an awkward angle. Water was coming in through the broken window now, cold and fast. The cabin had maybe 18 inches of air at the ceiling, and that number was dropping. The woman in the driver's seat was conscious. That was the first thing. Her eyes were open, and they found Mason's face immediately, which he took as a good sign. "I'm going to get you out," Mason said. He did not say it's okay. He'd learned a long time ago that telling people things were okay when they clearly weren't helped. Nobody. "You need to stay still for 10 seconds while I work on the belt." Her name was not something he knew yet. What he knew was that she was maybe 30, early 30s, dark hair matted against her face, blood from somewhere above her eyebrow tracking down the side of her nose. She was wearing a gray blazer that cost more than Mason's monthly electric bill. Her mouth was moving. "I can't..." She stopped. Tried again. "My leg is caught. I see it." The seat mounting had buckled and the seat frame had shifted into her lower left leg. Not pierced, he checked that first, but jammed. "Listen to me. When I lift, I need you to push with your right foot. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Do it when I say 3, not before." She nodded. Her jaw was tight. She was frightened. Anyone would be frightened. But she was listening, and that mattered. The seatbelt latch was distorted from the impact. The buckle jammed. Mason had the punch tool in his hand. He used the small blade on the reverse side to saw through the belt webbing at the shoulder. Took 4 seconds. The water was at his chest now, the cold working into him in a way that made his hands slower than he wanted. "Okay." He found the seat frame with both hands. 1, 2, 3. He lifted. She pushed. The seat gave with a sound like a staple gun, one sharp crack, and her leg came free. She gasped. "Arm around my neck," Mason said. "Hold on and don't help, just hold." He pulled her out backward through the rear window, and the vehicle shifted beneath them as he did it, groaning, the nose going deeper. They cleared the glass frame. He felt it drag across his back, adding to whatever the window had already done. And then he was in open water, pushing for the channel bank with one arm and his legs while she held on. He got her onto the bank. He climbed up after her, arms shaking. They both sat there for a moment on the wet gravel, breathing hard. The Escalade behind them gave one long metallic moan and slid further under. Within 30 seconds, only the top of the rear bumper was visible. Mason became aware that his hand was bleeding in a serious way. He looked at it without interest, wrapped it against his knee. "Are you hurt anywhere that's not your head?" he asked. She was pressing one hand to the cut above her eyebrow, the other flat on the gravel, steadying herself. Her blazer was ruined. She looked at him, really looked at him, with an expression he couldn't read. Like she was trying to figure out where he fit in a system she understood and finding no category. "My leg," she said. I don't think anything's broken. It doesn't feel broken." "It might not. You'll want that checked." He pulled out his phone, waterlogged, black screen, done, and swore quietly. "Mine." She reached into her blazer pocket with a hand that was not entirely steady. Miraculously, it had survived in a zippered interior pocket. She held it out to him. He dialed 911 and gave the location with the kind of specificity that made the dispatcher ask twice if he was law enforcement. He said he wasn't. He gave the cross streets and the mileage marker and the channel depth and the temperature of the water and the approximate displacement of the vehicle. The dispatcher said units were 12 minutes out. Mason said thank you and handed the phone back. He stood and walked to the channel edge. He stood there for a long moment. Then he crouched. The brake line. It was there. Or rather, It was gone, severed at the fitting with a cut that was clean in a way that didn't happen during accidents. He'd seen improvised cuts before. He'd seen deliberate ones. This was deliberate. Clean tool, clean angle, done by someone who knew what they were doing and exactly how much to cut so that failure would be gradual. Not immediate, not dramatic, but timed. Timed for a highway. He straightened up. Behind him, the woman was watching him. He walked back to her. "Did you check something?" she asked. "The vehicle." He paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear. She'd already processed fear. It was still there, but she was working past it. What replaced it was a kind of sharp attention, like she knew what was coming. "Does anyone know which route you took this morning?" Mason asked. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "I take Route 9 twice a week," she said carefully. "My driver knows. My assistant knows. A few others in my security rotation." "Your regular driver. Did he show up this morning?" She looked at him differently now. "No, I got a message saying he'd called in sick. I drove myself." Her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. "You're not asking these things because you're curious." "No," Mason said. "I'm not." He didn't tell her what he'd seen. Not exactly. But he told her that her vehicle needed to be secured as a crime scene before anyone else arrived, and she understood what that meant. She didn't argue. She didn't ask a dozen follow-up questions, which Mason noted. She called someone, 2 words, controlled, and a number. And by the time the paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, 2 other vehicles were already pulling onto the shoulder above the channel. Mason waited until the paramedics had her. Then he picked up his jacket from the gravel, retrieved his waterlogged phone, and walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat. He was soaked through. His back was bleeding from where the window glass had dragged across it. Nothing serious, but the shirt and the jacket were done. The burgundy tie was somewhere in the drainage channel. His interview folder had slid off the passenger seat at some point and was on the floor, wet along one edge. He looked at the dashboard clock. He was 43 minutes late. He drove to Aurelia Systems anyway. The lobby was everything Mason would have expected and had prepared himself not to be impressed by. Glass and steel, and the particular kind of ambient quiet that expensive architecture manufactures on purpose. All of it designed to communicate that the people who worked here operated at a level that other people could only observe. The receptionist looked up, looked at Mason, soaked clothes, cut hand wrapped in a folded gas station napkin, no jacket, no tie, and her expression completed a very small but legible journey. "Mason Rourke," he said. "I have an interview with the hiring director. I'm aware I'm late." She typed something and looked at her screen for a moment before responding. "Mr. Cavett asks if you can take a seat." He sat. He sat for 11 minutes. Gerald Cavett came out of a side corridor rather than through the main elevator bank, which Mason noticed because it suggested the man had been close by and had made a choice about how long to let him wait. He was mid-50s, suit jacket, the specific kind of physical confidence that came from having been right about enough things in a row that he'd stopped considering the alternative. He stopped in front of Mason without extending his hand. "You understand we've been waiting for over an hour," Cavett said. "I do," Mason said. "I had an emergency on Route 9 that I couldn't leave." "What kind of emergency?" It wasn't a question, it was a test of whether Mason would produce an excuse or a fact. Mason registered this and found he was too tired and too wet to perform anything. "A vehicle went into the drainage channel off the highway. I stopped and pulled the driver out before the paramedics arrived." Cavett looked at him for a moment. At the wet clothes, the wrapped hand, the folder. "Is that something you do often?" he said. "Stop at accidents." Mason said, "I stop when people need stopping for." Cavett let that sit. "Mr. Rourke," he said, and his tone had already closed something down. "The Director of Emergency Operations position requires someone who can manage institutional crises with discipline and punctuality. Arriving to a senior executive interview looking like you've spent the morning in a ditch it tells us something." Mason held Cavett's gaze. He said nothing. "We won't be proceeding today," Cavett said. "I hope your morning gets better." He walked back to the corridor. Mason stood there in the lobby for perhaps 3 seconds. The receptionist had found something very important to look at on her desk. 2 men near the elevator had clocked the exchange, and were now very carefully not reacting. Mason picked up his folder. He walked outside. He sat in his truck for a while with the engine off. The rain had eased to something lighter, more of a mist now, running down the windshield in broken lines. His back was stiffening where the glass had caught him. His hand had started to actually hurt, which meant the adrenaline was fully out of his system now and his body was recalculating. He thought about calling someone, his sister in Portland, his old team sergeant, retired now, living in Colorado. He thought about it and didn't do it. He thought about Ellie, who was in school right now, working on something in the art class she loved, probably with paint on her sleeves. He started the truck. He had a night shift at the repair facility starting at 7. He'd go home first, change the shirt, find out if his phone would survive a few hours in dry rice. He'd pick Ellie up at 3:15, same as always. He didn't know. As he pulled out of the Aurelia Systems parking lot and merged onto a road that was no longer raining, that 45 minutes from now, in a hospital 2 miles east of Route 9, a woman would wake up with a drip line in her arm and a bandage above her eye. That she would look at the bedside table and see something unexpected. A waterlogged manila folder, recovered from the gravel near the drainage channel by a paramedic who'd assumed it belonged to the patient. Inside, slightly wrinkled but legible, a printed cover sheet bearing the name Mason Rourke, along with his phone number, and at the top right corner typed in standard application font, applicant, Director of Emergency Operations, Aurelia Systems. That the woman, Serena Halstead, CEO of Aurelia Systems, would lie in that hospital bed and hold that folder for a long time, and that what she would feel reading his name was not gratitude. It was something closer to shame. The hospital discharged Serena Halstead at 6:40 in the evening with 7 stitches above her left eyebrow, a bruised tibia that was not fractured, and instructions to rest for 48 hours that she had no intention of following. Her assistant, a young man named Derek, who had worked for her for 2 years and had learned to read her moods with the accuracy of someone whose employment depended on it, was waiting at the discharge entrance with a company car. He held an umbrella. He did not ask how she was feeling because he could see how she was feeling, and he understood that commenting on it would not help either of them. She got into the back seat with the manila folder on her lap. She'd asked the nurse about it. The paramedic who brought it in had assumed it came from the crash site, probably from a vehicle that had stopped. Nobody knew whose it was until Serena opened it in the hospital bed and found the Aurelia Systems application header and the name printed in plain, unadorned 12-point font, Mason Rourke, Director of Emergency Operations. She'd called Aurelia's HR from her hospital room while the IV was still in her arm. The woman on the other end had taken a moment to locate the file and then said carefully that Mr. Rourke had arrived to his final interview approximately 50 minutes late and that Gerald Cavett had determined not to proceed. "What reason did he give for being late?" Serena asked. A pause. Mr. Cavett's notes indicate that no satisfactory explanation was provided. Serena had set the phone down on the blanket without hanging up. Now, in the back of the car, she watched the city pass outside the rain-streaked window and thought about the cut on the man's hand, wrapped in a folded gas station napkin. The way he'd looked at Cavett, not angry, not defensive, just steady in the way that people are steady when they've been through worse and know it. The specificity with which he'd called in the accident location, channel depth, water temperature, vehicle displacement. Not the language of a man who stumbled onto situations, the language of a man who assessed them. She opened the folder again and looked at his resume for the 3rd time. Former Navy SEAL. 12 years of service, specialized in reconnaissance, extraction, and crisis response. Honorable discharge. Since then, industrial equipment repair, contract maintenance work, 2 years as a night shift supervisor at a facility in Harwick. The gap between the military career and the current one was not explained, and he hadn't tried to explain it. Most candidates Serena had noticed over years of hiring over-explained the gaps. They built narratives around them. Mason Rourke's resume simply noted the dates and let whoever was reading it decide what they thought. She closed the folder. "Derek," she said. "Yes." "The repair facility on Cannery Road. Do you know the one?" He did not ask why. He adjusted the route. The facility was still running when they arrived. It operated 2 shifts and the night crew was an hour into their rotation. The floor was loud with the kind of industrial noise that sits somewhere between mechanical and physical, the kind you feel in your chest. Serena walked in wearing a hospital discharge bracelet and a blazer that had been dried by the hospital's lost and found dryer and still smelled faintly of drainage water. The floor supervisor, a heavy-set man with a beard and a Harwick Gulls cap, looked at her with the expression of someone trying to determine if this was some kind of inspection. "I'm looking for Mason Rourke," Serena said. The supervisor looked over his shoulder, then back at her. "He clocked in about an hour ago, Bay 3. Bay 3 was at the far end of the floor where two large compressor units were mounted on a steel frame, the casings open, the internal components laid out on a rolling cart with the systematic organization of someone who knew what they were doing. Mason was crouched beside the lower unit with a flashlight in his teeth and a multimeter in his hands. He was wearing a gray work shirt with his name on the left chest pocket. His right hand was wrapped in clean white medical tape. He heard her approaching. She was certain he heard her the moment she entered the bay, before she got within 20 feet, but he finished what he was testing before he looked up. He straightened slowly, took the flashlight out of his mouth, and looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You look better than this morning," Mason said finally. 7 stitches. He nodded. "The cut was deep, but not long. You probably felt it was worse than it was because of the water in your eyes." "Yes." She paused. "How did you know that?" "I've had stitches." Serena looked at his hand. "More than your hand." "More than my hand," he agreed. He set the multimeter down on the cart. "You didn't come here to talk about stitches." "No." She reached into her bag and held out the folder. "This is yours. It fell in the channel." He looked at it. He took it. He set it on the cart next to the multimeter without looking at it again. "I spoke to HR," Serena said. "I know what happened with the interview." Something moved through Mason's expression, but it wasn't embarrassment. It was closer to the look of a man who'd already processed a thing and put it away and didn't particularly want it unpacked in a repair bay by a woman he'd pulled out of a drainage channel. "It's done," he said. "It doesn't have to be." "Ms. Halstead, Serena, I appreciate that you came here. I understand what you're trying to do." He picked up the flashlight, clicked it off, set it down again. Small gestures, she noticed, things to do with his hands while he chose his words. "But I don't want the job because you feel you owe me something. That's not how I want to start anywhere." "What if I told you I'd reviewed your application independently of this morning, before this morning?" "Had you?" She paused. "No." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "Then we both know where we are." "I'll offer you something different." She held his gaze. "Not the position, not yet. I want to hire you as an independent security consultant for 48 hours. Paid, separately, nothing to do with the director role. I need someone to look at what happened this morning with fresh eyes. The people I have in-house are the people who are supposed to prevent it." Mason was quiet for a moment. "You know what I saw on the brake line?" he said. "Yes." "I didn't tell you what I saw on the brake line." "No," she said. "But you asked me who knew my route, and the way you asked it told me everything else." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the bay, a pneumatic tool fired somewhere on the floor. The compressor unit ticked as it cooled. 48 hours, Mason said. "And this doesn't connect to the other thing. Whatever I find, I report to you directly, and after 48 hours you take it to whoever you decide to take it to." "Agreed. I need access to your building's security logs for the past 2 weeks. Whoever pulled those cameras before you left this morning, that pull request will be somewhere." Serena didn't blink. "I'll have Derek clear your credentials by 7 a.m. And I need to know who knew your route." She was already reaching for her phone. "I'll have a list for you tonight." Mason looked at the compressor unit, then back at her. He seemed to be weighing something that wasn't about the job or the money, something more internal and harder to name. The calculation of a man who had spent years keeping his particular skill set in a box and was being asked by someone he'd pulled out of a drowning car to open it again. "One more thing," he said. "Nobody at Aurelius knows my background. I'd prefer it stays that way while I'm working." "Understood." "That includes Cavett." Something flickered across her face. "Especially Cavett," she said, and there was a flatness to it that told Mason this was a conversation that had its own history. He nodded once. She left. Mason stood in Bay 3 for a moment after she was gone, the manila folder on the cart beside his tools. Then he picked up the multimeter, crouched back down next to the compressor unit, and went back to work. He had 4 hours left on his shift. The compressor needed finishing, and whatever came next could wait until morning. He was at the Aurelia Systems campus by 6:55. Derek, the assistant, met him at a side entrance with a temporary badge and a brief professional handshake. The badge had Mason's name and the designation Security Consultant, External, which told anyone who checked that he had access but no institutional standing. He preferred it that way. Institutional standing made people perform for you. An external consultant with a badge was either ignored or mildly resented, and both responses were useful in their own way. He started in the Security Operations Center on the 3rd floor. The team there was 3 people on the early shift, a young woman named Tran who seemed to actually know what she was doing, and 2 men who seemed to be performing the idea of knowing what they were doing. Mason introduced himself as a consultant brought in by the CEO's office following a vehicle incident and left it at that. Tran pulled up the camera logs without being asked twice. The cameras. 17 minutes. That was the window. 17 minutes before Serena's departure, the exterior cameras covering the employee garage and the 3 exit routes had been cycled into a maintenance mode loop that showed 30 seconds of empty footage on repeat. Someone had used an internal override code to do it. The override code required level 4 security clearance, and there were exactly 9 people at Aurelius with that clearance. Serena's name was one of them. So was Lydia Vanes. Does the override log a user ID when it's initiated? Mason asked Tran. It's supposed to, she said, and the supposed to landed with enough weight that Mason set down his coffee. Show me the log entry for that morning. She pulled it up. The user field was blank. Not redacted, not corrupted, blank as if the field had been deliberately cleared after the fact. That's not a system error, Mason said. No, Tran said, it's not. She said it the way people say things when they've already known something was wrong and have been waiting for someone else to say it first. Mason moved to the building's transportation coordination system next. Serena's regular driver was a man named Paul, who had been with Aurelius for 6 years. The message telling him not to report that morning had come through the company's internal scheduling portal, routed through a generic dispatch account used for last-minute adjustments. The account had been accessed at 4:47 a.m. using Paul's own credentials. Paul, when Mason reached him by phone, said he had not logged into the system at 4:47 a.m. Were you asleep? Mason asked. I was asleep at 4:47. I was asleep until 6:15. I wake up at 6:15 every morning. Did you receive the message yourself, or did the system just not schedule you? Both. I got the message on my phone. It came through the Aurelius Dispatch app. It said Ms. Halstead would be using a personal vehicle and to take the day. I thought it was unusual, but she'd done it before. Not often. Who else would know that? That she'd occasionally drive herself? A pause. Her assistant. Whoever manages her calendar on the executive side. Her head of security, probably. Mason thanked him and hung up. He sat with that for a minute. Someone had used Paul's credentials to send the message. That meant either Paul's login had been stolen, or someone with administrative access to the dispatch system had sent it on his behalf. Either way, it was pre-planned. This was not reactive. This was coordinated across at least 3 separate systems: cameras, transportation scheduling, and the vehicle itself, which meant whoever did it had both the technical knowledge and the internal access to move across all 3 without triggering any of the standard alerts. That was a short list of people. He asked Derek for Serena's direct schedule for the previous 6 weeks. Derek sent it to him within the hour, and Mason spent 90 minutes going through it in a conference room he'd been given on the 3rd floor, a small room with a window that faced the parking structure and a whiteboard that had someone else's business strategy still written on it in red marker. He found it on the 3rd pass. Every time Serena had taken Route 9 to the morning meeting she attended bi-weekly at the Harwick Port Authority, 7 times in the past 6 weeks, her departure time and route had been logged in the executive schedule under a standing entry. The standing entry had been modified 2 weeks ago. The modification added a field, route confirmed, Harwick Coastal 9, direct. That field had not been there in the earlier entries. It was added after the 7th instance of her taking that route. Someone had waited, watched, and then documented the pattern with enough specificity to plan around it. Mason photographed the screen with a camera he'd brought. Not his phone, an actual camera, a small Nikon he used for equipment documentation at the repair facility, and then went looking for who had modified the schedule entry. The edit trail in the scheduling system required administrator access to view. It took him until early afternoon and a second conversation with a visibly uncomfortable IT manager named Reeves to get it. Reeves kept saying he'd need to check with legal. Mason said that was fine, but the CEO's office had authorized the review, and whatever Reeves decided to do would become part of the consulting report, which Serena Halstead would be reading tonight. Reeves accessed the edit trail. The modification to the schedule entry had been made from a workstation registered to the office of the Chief Strategy Officer, Lydia Vane. Mason wrote the name on a page of his notebook. He didn't circle it or underline it. He wrote it plainly, the way you write something when you're not sure yet if it means what it looks like it means. Because he had been in enough situations to know that obvious trails were sometimes obvious for a reason that had nothing to do with truth. And sometimes they were obvious because the person who made them was confident they'd never be found. He went to see Serena at 4 p.m. She was in her office on the executive floor, back at work, which did not surprise him. The office was large but not ornate. She had a standing desk that was currently in the seated position, a wall of windows facing the harbor, and a credenza with several framed photographs and a small stack of physical books that looked read rather than decorative. She was on a call when he came in. She held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and he sat down across from her desk and looked out the window while she finished. When she hung up, she looked at him with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting for news and is preparing themselves for it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. The cameras, Paul's credentials, the schedule modification, the edit trail. He laid it out in sequence and without editorial, because that was how he'd been trained to brief, and it was the only way he knew to do it cleanly. Serena was quiet for a moment when he finished. "Lydia has been with me for 5 years, she said. The sentence wasn't a defense. It was something more like a person sitting with the weight of what a sentence means. "The trail points to her workstation," Mason said. "That's not the same thing as pointing to her." "Is that what you believe? That it's not her?" He was quiet for a moment. "I believe that whoever is behind this is careful enough to have disabled cameras, manipulated credentials, and cut a brake line without leaving obvious physical evidence. That person doesn't also accidentally leave an edit trail in a scheduling system." Serena looked at him. "Unless they didn't think anyone would know to look there." "Yes," Mason said. "That's the other possibility." She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the harbor was gray-green in the late afternoon light, container ships sitting heavy and still on the water. "There's something you need to know," she said. "Something I didn't include in the background materials I gave Derek." She paused. "We have a pending acquisition offer. A consortium, calls itself Meridian Capital Partners, is attempting to purchase Aurelius's defense technology division. It's worth approximately $4 billion to certain parties, depending on how the transaction is structured." Mason waited. "I've been blocking it," she said, "for 8 months. The board is split. As CEO, I have the authority to prevent the vote from going forward while I conduct additional due diligence. But," she turned from the window, "if I'm incapacitated, medically, or dead, the board can vote without me." The room was quiet enough that Mason could hear the building's ventilation system. "Who on the board supports the acquisition?" he asked. 4 members, definitively. 2 are undecided. 3 oppose it, including me." She looked at him steadily. "If I'm removed from the equation, the 2 undecided members both have prior relationships with Meridian." "And Lydia?" Serena held his gaze. "Lydia has been my most vocal supporter on the acquisition. She believes I'm being obstructionist. She's argued in board sessions that my opposition is personal rather than strategic." She paused. "She's not entirely wrong about that, but she's also not entirely right." "What's her stake in the deal?" "Nothing that's been disclosed." Mason looked at his notebook, then at her. "I need 2 more things. First, I need someone to quietly pull Lydia's financial records, not her company compensation, her external accounts. Whatever is legally accessible. Second, I need the full board communications log for the past 8 months, specifically any messages that touch on the acquisition or your medical schedule." "I can get the board communications," Serena said. "The financial records. I have someone. Mason said. She looked at him. It was the first moment, he thought, that she'd stopped treating him as a contractor she'd hired and started looking at him. The way people look at someone when they realize the person is more than the box they'd put them in. Who? She asked. A former colleague. She does investigative work now. I trust her. He didn't elaborate, and Serena didn't push. He was standing to leave when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. No name, no greeting, just a photograph. The photograph was taken from a distance through what he judged to be a medium telephoto lens. It showed a street corner he recognized immediately, the corner of Birch and Canfield, 2 blocks from Ellie's school. It showed a small figure in a yellow jacket walking down the sidewalk with a backpack. Ellie's yellow jacket, Ellie's backpack. The timestamp on the photograph was 3:18 p.m. today. Below the photograph, 6 words. Walk away, or she becomes next. Mason's face went very still. He was aware of Serena saying something, saying his name probably, because she'd seen his expression change, but her voice was at a distance. His mind had moved somewhere else entirely, to a place that was very cold and very focused, and from that place he ran the calculation in under 4 seconds. They had people near Ellie's school, or they had someone who could pull a photograph from a device near Ellie's school, which meant either surveillance or a contact in the area. The photograph was real. He'd recognized that jacket anywhere, had bought it 2 winters ago from a sale rack at the sporting goods store on Main, had written Ellie's name on the tag in black marker because she kept leaving it places. She was walking home. That meant the after-school aide had released her at 3:15 as normal. That meant she was safe right now, or had been at 3:18, but 3:18 was 40 minutes ago, and Mason was 22 minutes from her school. I have to go, he said. Serena stood. What happened? He showed her the phone. He watched her read it. He watched her face do the thing people's faces do when something moves from abstract to real. Go, she said immediately. Go right now. Don't call anyone, Mason said. His voice was flat and even, and it was the voice of someone who had learned that the tone you use in a crisis affects everyone around you, and what he needed from Serena right now was composure. Not security, not anyone internal. Not yet. Why? Because whoever sent this has access to your internal communications. We just spent 4 hours establishing that. She understood. She sat back down. He was already moving. He drove to the school in 19 minutes, which was not possible under normal circumstances, but which he made possible by knowing which lights had longer yellows and which side streets bypassed the Route 9 congestion and what a rolling stop looked like when done at exactly the right speed. Ellie was at the corner of Birch and Canfield, sitting on the low brick wall outside the pharmacy, doing what she always did when she'd missed the window to get home before dark came down. She sat and she waited and she read her book. She looked up when his truck pulled to the curb. You're late, she said. I know. He got out and crouched down in front of her. He did a quick check, eyes, posture, the space around her. You okay? She looked at him with the particular expression 8-year-olds reserve for adults who ask obvious questions. I'm reading. I see that. He took her backpack. Let's go. She climbed into the passenger seat and buckled herself in, which she was very proud of being old enough to do without being told. She opened her book again. Mason pulled into traffic, checked his mirrors twice, and then checked them again. Daddy? Ellie said, without looking up from her book. Yeah. Why do you look like you're in a car commercial? Like all serious with your jaw. He exhaled. I had a long day. You always have a long day. This one was longer. She turned a page. Did you get the job? He'd forgotten, momentarily, that she knew about the interview in the way that kids know about things. Imperfectly and completely at the same time. He told her there was a meeting with important people. She'd apparently done her own translation. Not yet, he said. But maybe? He looked at her. She was still reading, the book held in both hands, her feet not quite reaching the floor mat. The yellow jacket was slightly too big for her. He'd bought it a size up so it would last 2 winters. Maybe, he said. He drove. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and his phone face down and a cup of coffee that had gone cold at his elbow. He wrote out everything he knew, in the order he knew it, and then he looked at the photograph on his phone again. The cold place in his chest was still there. He'd felt it before, Not often, but enough times to know what it was. It was the feeling of something shifting in him, the feeling of the lock on a door he'd kept closed for years beginning, slowly and against his preference, to open. He called the number that had sent the photograph. It rang once. Then, nothing. A dead line. He hadn't expected anything different. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name. Reyes D., a former colleague. 8 years in naval intelligence before she left to do the kind of investigative work that large organizations hired when they needed things found that other people didn't want found. She was thorough, she was discreet, and she answered on the second ring even at 11 p.m. because she always had. Mason. Diane. A pause. It's been a while. It has. I need a favor. He paused. Actually, I need several favors, and I need them fast. He heard her shift, the sound of someone moving from one position to another, probably sitting up, the way Diane always sat up when a conversation got interesting. Tell me. He told her about Serena, about Aurelius, the acquisition, the brake line, about Lydia Vane and the schedule modification, and the trail that might have been planted or might have been real, about Paul's credentials and the camera override and the $4 billion in the background of all of it. Then he told her about the photograph. Diane was quiet for a moment after he finished. You sure you want to do this? She asked, not skeptically. The way someone asks when they already know the answer but understand that the asking matters. Mason looked at the kitchen, which was quiet and lit by one lamp, and contained a drawing Ellie had made of a horse that was taped to the refrigerator with 2 pieces of yellow tape. I'm sure, he said. Diane said she'd have preliminary financial records on Lydia Vane within 36 hours. She said she'd also run the Meridian Capital Partners structure, which she suspected was going to be interesting because outfits that moved $4 billion in defense tech acquisitions tended to have layers that didn't survive close inspection. After he hung up, Mason sat for another few minutes. Then he went to the small closet off of the hallway, the one behind the winter coats, the one Ellie had never had reason to open because it was boring and contained nothing relevant to an 8-year-old's life. And from the top shelf, behind a box of tax documents, he retrieved a flat case about the size of a hardcover book. He set it on the kitchen table. He looked at it for a moment. He opened it. Inside was a small body camera, compact, military spec, the kind that clips to clothing and transmits encrypted footage to a remote server. It was several years old, but he'd maintained it, the way he maintained most things, quietly, without particular reason, the way certain habits outlast the lives they were built for. He closed the case. He put it in his work bag. He went to bed, and he lay in the dark, and he listened to the house settle around him, and he thought about everything he'd spent years walking away from and what it meant that he was now, carefully and with full awareness of what he was doing, walking back. Diane Reyes called at 6:47 the following morning, while Mason was making Ellie's lunch, and Ellie was upstairs doing something to her hair that she'd been doing for 15 minutes, and that Mason had learned not to comment on. You're going to want to sit down, Diane said. I'm standing. Then keep standing and listen. He could hear her clicking through something on her end, keyboard probably, the fast, efficient clicking of someone who types faster than most people think. Lydia Vane, 41, Northwestern MBA, 15 years in corporate strategy across 3 different firms before she landed at Aurelius 5 years ago. Clean professional record, solid reputation, the kind of person who gets described in industry profiles as a sharp operator with good instincts. A pause. Her personal finances tell a different story. Mason set down the knife he'd been using to cut an apple into eighths because Ellie refused to eat apple slices that weren't exactly the right size, a preference Mason had long since stopped fighting. How different, he said. 18 months ago, Lydia opened a private investment account through a Cayman-registered wealth management firm called Verano Partners. The account has received 4 wire transfers since then. Total deposited, $2.3 million. Another click. Verano Partners, when you pull the corporate structure, is a subsidiary of a holding company registered in Luxembourg. That holding company is a partial owner of, and here's where it gets interesting, Meridian Capital Partners. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. She's on the payroll of the consortium trying to buy the division, Mason said. Has been for a year and a half. The first transfer came in approximately 6 weeks after she reportedly began pushing Serena Halstead to approve the acquisition. Diane paused. That's not a coincidence. That's a timeline. Mason picked up the apple pieces and put them in Ellie's lunch container. His hands were steady. They were always steady when something resolved into clarity, which was one of the things about himself that he didn't entirely like. "What about Meridian itself?" he asked. "What's the structure?" "Complex, the kind of complex that costs a lot of money to make look normal. On the surface, it's a legitimate private equity consortium. They have real investments, real portfolio companies, the whole architecture. But when you go 3 layers in, two of the major funding sources are entities that have been flagged by Treasury for potential connections to foreign defense procurement networks." She said it evenly, but the weight of it came through. "This isn't just a corporate acquisition, Mason. Someone is trying to move Aurelius's defense tech division into a structure that could ultimately move that technology to people who shouldn't have it." Ellie appeared at the kitchen doorway, backpack on, hair in a braid that was slightly lopsided but that she was clearly proud of. "I'm ready," she announced. Mason held up one finger. "I need everything documented," he told Diane. "Everything you just told me, formatted so it's legible to someone without a financial background. And I need it encrypted and sent to 2 separate addresses. Mine and one other I'll give you." "How fast?" "Tonight." A brief silence. "You're going to do something tonight." "I'm considering it." "Mason." Diane's voice shifted in a way that was neither maternal nor sentimental, but was something in between. The voice of someone who had known him long enough to know what considering it actually meant. "How bad is the threat to the girl?" He looked at Ellie, who was now examining the braid in the reflection of the microwave door. "Bad enough," he said. "Then be careful in the specific ways that actually matter, not the ones that just feel like being careful." He knew what she meant. He said goodbye and hung up. The drive to school was 7 minutes. Ellie talked for most of it about a project her class was doing on ecosystems, and Mason listened with the portion of his attention that wasn't running logistics, which was enough to ask the right questions and make the right sounds. He'd become good at that over the years. The divided attention of a parent who has learned that the ordinary conversation matters even when the extraordinary one is still running in the background. He pulled up to the school, and she got out and then turned back. "Daddy." "Yeah." "Are you going to pick me up today?" "Yes." "Not late?" "Not late." She seemed to weigh this. "Okay." She hoisted her backpack and walked toward the doors without looking back, which was something she'd started doing recently and which Mason understood meant she was practicing at independence, the way kids practice things they want to be true of themselves. He watched her go inside. Then he pulled out his phone and called Serena. She answered on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept much either. "I have information," he said. "But before I give it to you, I need to tell you something first, and I need you to hear it completely before you react." A pause. "Go ahead." He told her about Diane's findings. All of it. Verano Partners, the 2.3 million, the Meridian structure, the Treasury flags. He laid it out the same way he'd laid out the building security findings the day before. In sequence, without editorializing, letting the facts do what facts do when they're arranged properly. When he finished, Serena was silent for long enough that he checked his phone to make sure the call was still connected. 5 years, she said finally. The 2 words had a texture to them, not quite grief, not quite rage, something that lived in the country between them. "I know." "She was at my house for Christmas dinner 2 years ago. She sat across from me and she—" Serena stopped. He heard her exhale. "I'm sorry, that's not useful right now." "It's not useful," Mason said. "It tells you something about what you're dealing with. Someone patient enough to sit across from you for 5 years and maintain that performance is not someone who panics. She's going to have contingencies." "What kind of contingencies?" "That's what I need to think through." He paused. "I need you to do something that's going to be difficult. I need you to behave normally around Lydia today. No changes in your interaction with her, no reduced access, nothing that would signal, He could hear what that cost her in the silence before she responded. "For how long?" she asked. "1 more day." "And then?" "Then we give her something to react to, and we watch how she reacts." He didn't tell her the rest of what he was thinking. Not yet. There were parts of it that she wouldn't agree to if he laid them out plainly, and he understood her well enough now to know that her instinct would be to protect him in a way that would compromise the plan. She was the kind of person who, when she felt she owed someone, tried to act on it. That instinct was decent and real, and right now, a liability. He spent the morning with Diane's preliminary report and the board communications log Serena had sent him at 11 p.m. the night before. He worked from the kitchen table, the body camera case sitting at the edge of his field of vision where he'd left it. The board communications were dense and mostly bureaucratic, the language of institutional power, hedged and formal, and stripped of anything that would look interesting in a deposition. But Lydia's contributions stood out. Over 8 months of discussions, she had systematically worked to isolate Serena. Not overtly, nothing so readable as direct opposition. Instead, she had positioned Serena's delays as personal rather than strategic, had subtly aligned the two undecided board members with the acquisition-supporting faction, and had twice arranged for outside consultants to present findings that undermined Serena's due diligence concerns without ever appearing to be the one driving those presentations. It was patient work, the kind of work that required someone to think several moves ahead and never let anyone see them thinking. Mason circled 3 specific message threads and photographed them. By noon, he had what he needed. He called Diane back and gave her the second address for the encrypted package. An investigator named Carl Whitmore, a former FBI financial crimes agent who now worked independently and whom Mason had met twice through mutual contacts and found to be thorough in the way that certain retired federal agents were thorough, which was to say compulsively and without much regard for regular working hours. He called Whitmore next. Whitmore listened to Mason's summary without interrupting, which was another quality Mason had come to associate with people who were actually good at their jobs. "You want me to hold the package and be ready to transmit to 3 specific recipients simultaneously," Whitmore said. "Yes, on my signal." "What's the signal?" "A text from this number that says execute. If you don't hear from me within 48 hours, or if you receive anything from me that's longer than 1 word, assume the situation has changed and transmit immediately." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "You're going in." "I'm going in." "Is the CEO aware of the full scope of what you're planning?" Mason looked out the kitchen window. "No." "She should be," Whitmore said. "Not my decision, but for the record." "Noted," Mason said. He picked Ellie up at 3:10, 5 minutes early, which pleased her. They went to the diner on Harbor Street, which they did roughly once a month. And Ellie got the grilled cheese and the chocolate milkshake because it was a special occasion, which Mason said it was without specifying why. She talked about the ecosystem project and about a girl in her class named Sophia who had a rabbit, and about whether she thought it would be reasonable to have a rabbit given that their apartment was, admittedly, not very large, but a rabbit didn't take up much space. Mason said he'd think about it. "You always say that," Ellie said. "I always do think about it." "And then?" "And then I think about the smell." She wrinkled her nose. "They don't all smell." "Sophia's rabbit smells," Mason said. "You told me that 3 weeks ago." Ellie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "He's getting better," she said finally. Mason drank his coffee. Outside the diner window, Harbor Street was doing its late afternoon thing. The fishing boats coming in, the cannery shift changing. A few tourists who'd arrived for the coastal trails, and were now discovering that Harwick was better in theory than in practice for people who'd expected somewhere prettier. He looked at Ellie. He had a thought that he recognized as the kind of thought you don't examine too closely in the moment. Something about how the ordinary texture of a Thursday afternoon, grilled cheese and rabbit arguments and harbor traffic, was both the reason you did certain things and the reason those things cost something to do. He put it away. "I need you to stay somewhere different tonight," he said. Ellie looked up. "Where?" "Mrs. Callahan's." Their neighbor 3 doors down, a retired teacher in her 60s who had a guest room and who Ellie had stayed with twice before during Mason's longer night shifts. "For how long?" "Maybe 2 nights. Maybe 1. She looked at him in the way that she sometimes did, with a focus that was slightly older than 8, that Mason had noticed developing in her over the past year, the particular attentiveness of a child who has learned that certain tones in a parent's voice mean something real is happening. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He had thought about this. What to say and how to say it. "There's something I have to take care of for work," he said. "And while I'm taking care of it, I want to know you're somewhere comfortable." "Is it dangerous?" "The work stuff? No." That was not entirely true, but it was true enough for a diner on Harbor Street on a Thursday afternoon. I just need to focus, and it's easier to focus when I know where you are. She seemed to sit with this for a moment. Okay, she said finally, and went back to her milkshake. He loved her for that, the trust, given simply, without performance. I was aware it was the kind of trust that had to be earned again and again, and that he had done nothing yet this week to deserve it specifically, and he made a private note of that in the way he made private notes of things that mattered. Mrs. Callahan was happy to have Ellie, asked no difficult questions, and had a lasagna in the oven that Ellie considered a significant upgrade from what Mason typically produced on weeknights. He helped Ellie with her bag, kissed the top of her head, and drove home. He stood in the apartment for a few minutes. Then he called Serena. I need to tell you what I'm planning to do tonight, he said. Serena arrived at his apartment 40 minutes later, which told him she'd driven herself and hadn't used the company car, which was smart. She was in dark clothes, which was either practical or coincidental, and she looked like someone who had spent the day doing something very difficult with their face and was now done performing. She sat at his kitchen table, and Mason stood across from it, and he told her. He told her he intended to go into Aurelius' headquarters that night, openly, using his consultant credentials. He told her he would announce publicly, through a carefully placed statement to one of the financial news services that covered the defense technology sector, that he had recovered the original vehicle telemetry data from Serena's Escalade and intended to hand it to federal investigators in the morning. The data doesn't exist, Serena said immediately. No, it's bait. She stared at him. You're going to walk into the building and wait for them to come to you. I'm going to walk into the building carrying a case that they'll believe contains the evidence, yes. Mason, the photograph of Ellie told me two things, he said. First, they're watching me. Second, they're scared. You don't threaten an 8-year-old because you're confident. You threaten an 8-year-old because something has started going wrong and you want it stopped. He paused. I'm giving them a reason to move, and when they move, they'll expose themselves. Whitmore holds the real evidence package, the financial records, the board communications, the camera logs. The moment anything happens inside that building tonight, he transmits. She was quiet for a long moment. You said you'd go in openly, she said, with your credentials. Yes. They'll know you're coming. That's the point. Serena looked at him with an expression that was complicated in ways she didn't bother to hide. I don't like this. I know. There are other ways to... Lydia has been planning this for 18 months, Mason said. She has people inside that building, she has the board partially aligned, and she has a communication structure we haven't fully mapped. If we go to the investigators with what we have right now, she has enough deniability to delay proceedings for months while Meridian finds another angle. The acquisition goes through under interim board authority, and whatever she was going to do about you, she does it more carefully the next time. He paused. We need her to act. Tonight. On our terms. The kitchen was quiet. What do you need from me? Serena asked. Be in the building, your office, publicly. Send an email at 9 p.m. about tomorrow's schedule, something routine. I want them to know you're there. But stay on the executive floor and don't move without texting me first. And if something goes wrong, text Whitmore directly. His number is on the card in that envelope. He slid a plain white envelope across the table. He transmits everything immediately. She took the envelope. She looked at it, then at him. You've done this before, she said. Not a question. Not this specifically. But things like this. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She seemed to understand that. The body camera, she said, looking at the case on the table. It transmits to a remote server Diane manages, audio and video. Whatever happens in that building tonight is recorded independently of anything they can access or destroy. Serena nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised him slightly. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. For what Cavett did. In the lobby. You came in soaked and bleeding and you just pulled me out of a car that was trying to kill me, and he stood there and... She stopped. I've been thinking about it since yesterday. About what that cost you. Not just the interview. What it cost you to walk out of there and say nothing. Mason looked at the envelope on the table. It was a bad morning, he said finally. I've had worse. That's not the same as it being acceptable. No, he agreed. It's not. She left at 9:15. Mason changed into dark clothing, checked the body camera twice, packed the case he would carry. A hard-sided aluminum case that contained nothing except a sealed envelope he'd prepared that morning, blank paper inside, weight calibrated to feel plausible, and drove to Aurelius Systems. He badged in at 9:52 p.m. The lobby was skeleton-staffed at this hour. A security guard at the desk, one more near the elevator bank. Both knew him by badge now, which was 3 days of consultant presence paying a specific dividend. He nodded to both and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. He set up in the conference room he'd been using, opened the case on the table where it would be visible from the corridor window, and sat down with his notebook. He waited. For 40 minutes, nothing happened. Then the building lost power. Not all at once. It dropped in sections, floor by floor, the emergency lighting kicking in a full 3 seconds late, which told Mason the backup generator had been delayed deliberately. Someone had accessed the power management system. In the dim red glow of the emergency strips, the building became a different architecture. The familiar geometry of office space replaced by something that felt more honestly like what it was. A series of corridors and rooms and stairwells that could be controlled or not controlled depending on who knew where the switches were. The elevator chimed and then went silent. The emergency exits locked. He heard the magnetic bolts engage from down the corridor, a sound like a row of small rifle actions. Then the fire alarm went off. It was the specific cadence of an evacuation alarm, not a suppression alarm, which meant the system had been triggered manually rather than by heat or smoke. Within 90 seconds, Mason could hear the building beginning to empty. The shuffle and murmur of the handful of staff still working late, moving toward the stairwells, doing what the alarm told them to do. He texted Serena, "Stay. Executive floor. Don't use elevator." Her response came in 4 seconds. "Already locked my office door. 3 people just passed my corridor going down." He texted Whitmore, "Building compromised. Record starts now." Then he moved. He left the conference room with the aluminum case in his left hand, leaving his right free. He moved down the corridor away from the main stairwell toward the maintenance access he'd identified on his first day. A narrow door behind the IT storage room that opened to a service corridor running parallel to the main hall. Older building construction, the kind where maintenance access was an afterthought added during a retrofit, which meant it appeared on exactly 0 of the floor plans in the Aurelius Facilities Management System. He'd found it on day 1 because he'd looked for it. He looked for things like that in every building he spent more than an hour in. It was not a habit he'd chosen. It was something that had become structural in him over 12 years of operating in environments where the difference between a known exit and an unknown one was sometimes the only margin that mattered. The service corridor was dark and smelled of dust and old cable insulation. He moved through it by memory. He'd walked it twice the previous day under the guise of looking for a bathroom, and emerged at the far end near the north stairwell, which had not been part of the main evacuation flow. He heard them before he saw them. 3 men. The stairwell above him, coming down, moving with the deliberate pace of people who were not evacuating. He could hear it in the footstep pattern, measured 2 by 2, one man slightly ahead of the others. They were wearing what sounded like rubber-soled work boots, and they were dressed as building security, which he confirmed when one of them swept a flashlight beam across the landing below, and the beam caught the edge of a Aurelius security patch on a jacket's shoulder. Not real security. Real Aurelius security had gone home at 6 p.m. These were the people Lydia had put in place. Mason backed into the maintenance corridor doorway. He let them pass. Then he moved to the secondary stairwell on the east side of the building, the one that connected to the executive floor, and went up. The executive floor was darker than the lower levels, the emergency strips here older and less bright, the red light thinner. Mason moved along the wall to Serena's office, knocked twice, the specific rhythm he'd told her to listen for, and heard the lock disengage. She was standing behind her desk with her phone in her hand and the lamp on because she'd found a flashlight in her drawer and positioned it to give her the desk without lighting the windows. She looked at him. 3 men in the building, he said quietly, coming from the north stairwell. They'll reach this floor in approximately 4 minutes. How do you know 4 minutes? Because the north stairwell is 12 floors, and they were moving at a professional pace, and they stopped on at least 1 floor on the way up. He set the aluminum case on her desk. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, not approximately, exactly. Tell me. When they reach this floor, they're going to find your office door locked and your lights off. I need you to kill the flashlight in 30 seconds. You don't answer. You don't move. Whatever they say, whatever they try, you stay still and you stay quiet and you text me every 60 seconds so I know you're okay." She looked at him steadily. "Where will you be?" "Not here." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She almost said something else. He could see it in her face, the thing she was deciding whether or not to say. Then she made her decision. "Be careful," she said, "and I don't mean that generically." He moved back into the corridor. The next 20 minutes were the kind of 20 minutes that Mason had spent years trying to forget he knew how to have. He used the building the way he'd been thinking about using it for 2 days, not as a structure to escape through, but as a structure to operate within. The maintenance shutters on the 4th floor that could be manually dropped to block corridor access. The backup generator panel in the sub-basement that could be selectively restored to power specific floors while leaving others dark. The surveillance blind spots he'd mapped on day 1 by walking the camera angles and noting where the coverage gaps fell. The specific geometry of corners and doorways that the system's designers had considered acceptable risk. He moved through all of it with the aluminum case, staying visible when he needed to be and invisible when he needed to be that, drawing the 3 men across 3 floors in a pattern that kept them moving without giving them what they came for. They were looking for the case, for the supposed evidence. He gave them glimpses of it, a reflection in a corridor window, a sound in a stairwell, and pulled it back. On the 6th floor, one of them got close. Close enough that Mason could see his face in the emergency lighting. Mid-30s, flat expression. The specific look of someone for whom this kind of work was professional rather than personal. He had a radio in his hand that he wasn't using, which meant he was communicating through something else. Something that didn't generate a signal the building's comm system would log. Mason let him get within 20 feet. Then he dropped the maintenance shutter behind him. A manual pull, old steel, the cable housing rattling in the dark, and was gone through the service access before the man could reorient. He was moving back toward the executive floor when his phone buzzed. "Serena. Someone outside my door, saying they're building security. There's a gas leak. I need to open up." Mason stopped. He typed back, "Don't open. Text me if door handle moves. 40 seconds. Serena. Handle moving." He was already running. He took the east stairwell at a pace that was not careful and not quiet. He hit the executive floor door and came through it fast, moving down the corridor toward Serena's office. And he saw her, not in her office, in the corridor, being walked towards the south stairwell by a woman in a dark suit who had one hand at Serena's elbow and who was talking to her in a low, steady voice. The woman was Lydia Vane. Mason stopped. Lydia had not seen him yet. She was focused on Serena, on the direction they were moving, on whatever she was saying in that low voice that had a quality of rehearsal in it. The voice of someone who had practiced this specific conversation. Mason watched for 3 seconds. Serena was not struggling. She was moving with Lydia, which meant Lydia had said something convincing enough to get her out of the office. But Serena's right hand, hanging at her side, was holding her phone with the screen facing her palm. She was texting without looking, the way people learn to do when they spend enough time on devices and need their hands to appear empty. The south stairwell. Mason had been in the south stairwell twice. He knew it connected to the parking structure on the level below ground. He also knew, because he'd mapped it on day 1, the same way he'd mapped everything else, that the south stairwell had no camera coverage between the 2nd floor landing and the parking level. A gap that appeared in the system as a maintenance issue logged 14 months ago and never resolved. 14 months ago. Around the time Lydia had received her first wire transfer, he watched Lydia guide Serena toward the stairwell door, and he watched Serena's hand, and he made the calculation. Then he said, "Lydia." His voice was level and conversational, and it carried down the corridor with no particular urgency, just a man saying a name. Lydia turned, and Mason watched her face in the emergency lighting, and what he saw there was not surprise. It was something he recognized from very specific professional contexts. The expression of someone who has just seen a variable they'd accounted for arrive slightly earlier than expected. She'd known he was in the building. Of course she had. She'd counted on it. "Mr. Rourke," Lydia said. Her voice was composed, which it would be. "You need to come with us. There's a gas leak on 3 floors and the building isn't safe. There's no gas leak, Mason said. He walked toward them at a pace that was unhurried. The building lost power because someone with access to the facility management system cycled the mains. The fire alarm was triggered manually, and the emergency exits are locked, which is illegal under fire code regardless of who has administrative override. Lydia looked at him. I don't know what you think is happening here. I know exactly which stairwells have been disabled, Mason said. And so do you. You just use that knowledge to choose this one. Something shifted in Lydia's expression. Small, controlled, but there. Serena had stopped moving. She was standing very still beside Lydia, and Mason could see in her face that she was tracking the exchange and understanding what it meant. Serena, Mason said, step away from her. Don't, Lydia started. The south stairwell camera has been offline for 14 months, Mason said. Logged as a maintenance issue, never repaired. I'm curious whether you reported it or whether you arranged for it to not be repaired. Lydia was quiet for a moment. You're making accusations, she said, that you cannot support. The 3 men you brought in tonight used override codes that require level 4 security access, Mason said. There are 9 people with that clearance. You're one of them. The override logs were cleared after the fact, the same technique used to clear the camera loop the morning of the crash. He was close now. 10 feet, 8. I've been in this building for 3 days, Lydia. I've read everything, and you made the mistake of underestimating how long 3 days can be for the right person. You have nothing, she said. Her voice had changed. The composed surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, the specific shift of a person who is recalculating. Diane Reyes says hello, Mason said, a full second of silence. Lydia's hand moved toward her jacket pocket, which was a decision made from somewhere that wasn't the rational part of her, and Mason was already moving before the motion completed. He covered the distance in 2 steps, had her wrist before the hand cleared the pocket, controlled it, kept his body between her and Serena. Don't, he said. Quiet. Direct. Not angry. Lydia went still. From below, Mason could hear footsteps on the stairwell. Real footsteps, multiple, and voices. And the specific quality of communication that was not the 3 men he'd been tracking, but something else. Radios. Standard police cadence. The real building security had apparently tripped a silent alarm. Or Whitmore had done something he hadn't been asked to do but had done anyway because he'd been an FBI agent for 20 years and had a sense for when a situation needed moving. The stairwell door opened, 3 uniformed officers, and behind them, slightly out of breath from the stairs, Carl Whitmore, who looked at Mason and then at Lydia and then at the position of Mason's hand on Lydia's wrist and said, with the patience of a man who had seen a great many things, I'll take it from here. Mason released her wrist. He stepped back. Lydia straightened. She was going to say something. He could see the preparation for it in her face, the construction of a narrative that would position her as the person who'd been trying to help. Mason knew the shape of it before she formed the first word. He said, the body camera has been transmitting to an independent server for the last hour and 20 minutes. He let that sit. Lydia looked at him, and whatever she'd been about to say, she didn't say it. Whitmore moved in, and 2 of the officers moved with him, and Serena stepped to Mason's side, not touching him, just standing beside him the way people stand beside each other when something has been survived, and neither of them has figured out yet what to say about it. From somewhere below, the building's power came back on, full, not emergency, the fluorescent overhead cycling up along the corridor in sequence, the building returning to itself. In the sudden ordinary light, Serena looked at Mason. He looked back at her. He became aware that his left hand was still holding the aluminum case, which contained blank paper and nothing else. Is that the evidence? She asked, nodding at it. No, he said. Then what's in it? Paper. She stared at him. You walked into a building with 3 armed men and a compromised power system carrying a case full of paper. The evidence is with Whitmore, Mason said. It's been with him since this afternoon. Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. You are, she said, a very strange man. Yes, Mason said. He set the case down on the floor. His back was aching from where the old glass cut had stiffened during the hour of movement, and his hand under the medical tape was throbbing in the way it had been throbbing all day. I really am. Down the corridor, Lydia was being walked to the stairwell by two officers, her posture still composed, her face giving nothing away. She passed a point where the corridor camera, fully restored now, running live, caught her in clear profile. Mason watched her go. He thought about the photograph of Ellie on the sidewalk, the yellow jacket, the backpack. He thought about the 6 words. He did not feel what he'd expected to feel at this moment, which was something like completion. What he felt instead was tired and cold from the building's air system, and aware that there were a great many things that would happen tomorrow that would require him to be clear-headed and exact. He picked up the aluminum case. "I need to call Ellie," he said. Serena nodded. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the ones that faced the harbor, the same view as Serena's office, the water black and flat under the night sky. And he dialed Mrs. Callahan's number. It rang twice. "Mr. Rourke?" "Yes. Is she asleep?" "Out like a light. She had 2 helpings of lasagna." A pause. "Everything all right?" "Yes," he said. "Everything's all right." He stood at the window for a moment after he hung up. The harbor was still out there, the same ships, the same geometry of docks and breakwater, the city around them running its quiet late-night version of itself. Behind him, he heard Serena come to stand a few feet away. Neither of them said anything. That was all right. There was a lot left to do, and tomorrow was going to be long, and some silences didn't need filling. They arrested Mason at 11:43 p.m. He had known it was coming. That was the part that would have been difficult to explain to anyone who wasn't standing in that corridor when it happened. The fact that he stepped back from Lydia, set the aluminum case on the floor, and waited for it with the specific patience of someone who had built the arrest into the plan from the beginning. The 2 officers who came for him were not the ones who'd taken Lydia. They came from the north stairwell, directed by a man in plain clothes who identified himself as Detective Sergeant Harlan Briggs, Financial Crimes Division, and who had the look of someone who'd been woken from something and was processing that displeasure professionally. Briggs was 50s, thick through the chest, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he kept forgetting were there and reaching for. "Mason Rourke," Briggs said. "Yes." "We need you to come with us." Serena stepped forward immediately. "This man has been working as a security consultant under direct authorization from my office. He has credentials. Ms. Halstead." Briggs's voice was not unkind, but it had a wall in it. "We've received information indicating that Mr. Rourke may have engineered the security incident this evening in order to establish himself as a necessary party to Aurelius's crisis response operations. We need to ask him some questions." The silence in the corridor was brief and very full. Mason looked at Serena. "It's all right," he said. "It is not—" "Serena." He held her gaze. "Call Whitmore. Tell him the situation. He knows what to do." She looked at him with an expression that was several things at once, a person who is used to having control over outcomes and is watching control move outside her reach. He understood all of it. He didn't have time to address all of it. "The 3-package system," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "Remember what I told you about the 3 packages?" She didn't know what that meant yet. He hadn't told her. But he needed her to hold the phrase until morning, and he could see from her face that she would. He went with Briggs. The processing took 2 hours. It was not the worst 2 hours Mason had spent in an institutional setting, which was a bar low enough that he didn't find much comfort in it, but it was what it was. He sat in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a 2-way mirror and a cup of coffee that tasted like something had happened to it, and he answered every question Briggs asked him fully and accurately, which was a choice that surprised Briggs in the specific way that honest answers in interrogation rooms always surprised detectives who'd spent long enough in them to expect the opposite. Yes, he had entered the building voluntarily, with valid credentials. Yes, he had announced publicly, through a contact at a financial news service, a 1-paragraph statement timed at 9 p.m., that he possessed vehicle telemetry data and intended to surrender it. No, the data did not exist. He explained why. Yes, he understood how that could be interpreted. "You're telling me," Briggs said, "that you fabricated evidence of evidence." "I announced the existence of evidence. What I put in the case was paper, with the intention of provoking a response from parties who believed the evidence was real." "Yes." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. He had his reading glasses in his hand now, folding them open and closed in a rhythm that seemed unconscious. And the woman, Lydia Vane, your position is that she was present in the building tonight to intercept and destroy that evidence, and to ensure Ms. Halstead didn't leave the building in a condition to testify to anything, Mason said. He said it plainly, without drama, because the plain version was the one that would hold up later when someone read the transcript. That's a serious allegation. Yes, Carl Whitmore has the documentation. He's been outside this building for the last 3 hours, and he's already made contact with your department's federal liaison because some of the financial material crosses jurisdictions. Briggs looked at the mirror, then back at Mason. You've been a busy guy, Briggs said. I had 48 hours, Mason said. I used them. Briggs left the room for 20 minutes. When he came back, he had a different quality to him. Not friendlier, but more careful. The way people become careful when something they'd been handed has turned out to be a different shape than they expected. Whitmore is outside, Briggs said. He says he has documentation for a financial crimes investigation involving multiple individuals connected to Aurelia Systems and a private equity consortium. He also has, Briggs checked something in his hand, audio and video from a body camera worn by you tonight, time-stamped and transmitted to an independent server, showing Ms. Vane making statements about the location of disabled building systems that were not publicly disclosed. Mason drank the bad coffee. There were 3 evidence packages prepared yesterday, Mason said. Each one contained a different location for the vehicle telemetry I announced I possessed. One said the data was stored at a Harwick Port Authority facility. One said a law office on Meridian Street. The third said an abandoned Aurelia storage facility on Route 12. He paused. Only one person outside of me and Carl Whitmore received a package, the one pointing to the Route 12 facility. Briggs was very still. Lydia Vane, Mason said. She received it through an anonymous message sent to an external email address she uses for communications that don't go through Aurelius's servers. Diane Reyes, my investigator, identified the address from the financial trail. We sent the package to that address at 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon. Briggs set his glasses down on the table. You're telling me, he said slowly, that before you ever entered that building, you'd already set a separate trap, one that would activate regardless of what happened inside. I needed a mechanism that didn't depend on the building operation succeeding, Mason said. If she'd anticipated the building play, the Route 12 facility would still tell me she was the one who received the package. It was a confirmation, not a dependency. Briggs looked at him for another long moment. Then he picked up his glasses, stood, and said he'd be back. He was gone for 47 minutes this time. Mason sat with the bad coffee and the fluorescent light and the two-way mirror and thought about Ellie sleeping at Mrs. Callahan's house, probably sprawled across the guest bed in the specific boneless way she slept when she was genuinely tired, one arm hanging off the side, her braid probably half undone. He thought about what Diane had said on the phone 2 days ago. Be careful in the specific ways that actually matter, not the ones that just feel like being careful. He'd been trying. He wasn't sure he'd entirely succeeded, but he'd been trying. When Briggs came back, he had another man with him. Younger, sharper suit, the kind of federal agency energy that is identifiable before the credentials come out. The credentials came out anyway. FBI Financial Crimes, an agent named Purcell who had the tight efficiency of someone midway through a career where performance was still tightly coupled to visibility. Mr. Rourke, Purcell said, sitting across from him. I've spent the last half hour reading Carl Whitmore's documentation. I have some questions. Go ahead. The storage facility on Route 12. Our people went there 40 minutes ago based on a tip from Mr. Whitmore. They found 2 individuals in the process of accessing a secured storage unit. Both have been detained. Purcell set a folder on the table, opened it, pushed a photograph across. Do you recognize either of these men? The photograph showed 2 men in custody restraints, taken outside what Mason recognized as a corrugated metal storage facility. Route 12, near the old Aurelius distribution warehouse that had been decommissioned 4 years back. Both men were mid-30s to early 40s, professional build, the kind of anonymous, competent faces that people in certain occupations cultivate deliberately. No, Mason said. But if their phones haven't been sanitized, you'll find communication with an external routing number that traces back to Verano Partners. That's the financial entity connected to Lydia Vane. He paused. And if you check the 3 men who are inside Aurelius tonight, you'll find the same number. Purcell looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the ceiling briefly. Mason was released at 2:17 in the morning. He walked out of the building into cold night air and found Carl Whitmore leaning against a car in the parking lot, drinking what appeared to be gas station coffee from a paper cup, with a look of a man who was too old for this and was doing it anyway. "Purcell give you trouble?" Whitmore asked. "No, he's good. He'll find the threads fast." Whitmore nodded. The Route 12 contractors had phones, unwiped. Whoever sent them there trusted that the operation would be clean enough that there was nothing to find. He paused. "It wasn't clean." "No," Mason said, "it wasn't." "Lydia's lawyer is already at the precinct," Whitmore said. "She's not talking, but the bank records don't require her to talk." Mason looked up at the sky. It was clear now. The rain system that had been sitting over Harwick for 3 days finally pushed east, and the stars were doing what stars do when you're outside at 2 a.m. on the coast, and the light pollution cooperates. They were present and indifferent in the way Mason had always found more honest than comforting, but had learned to appreciate anyway. "What about the board?" Mason asked. "Serena's been on calls for the last 2 hours. She's got 3 members locked in opposition to the acquisition. The 2 undecided ones went to ground when the FBI showed up." Whitmore finished his coffee. "The acquisition is functionally dead. They can't proceed with an ongoing federal investigation into the primary facilitator." Mason nodded. "You should sleep," Whitmore said. "Yes." "Are you going to?" Mason thought about it. "For a few hours." Whitmore made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged the limitations of the answer. He got in his car and drove. Mason stood in the parking lot alone for a moment. The body camera was still clipped to his shirt, dead now, battery run out sometime in the last hour. He unclipped it and put it in his jacket pocket. He drove home. He was at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. with his notebook and a glass of water when his phone rang. The screen said Serena Halstead, which was not a surprise. "You should sleep," he said when he answered. "You're awake." "That's different." A brief silence. "Purcell called me. They're opening a formal investigation into Meridian Capital Partners. The 2 men from Route 12. Their phones had messages. Direct messages to a number registered to a shell entity that Diane traced to Lydia's account structure." She paused. "It's moving fast." "It'll move faster in the morning. The financial layer is what takes time. Purcell's people will be in Lydia's accounts by noon." "Mason." Her voice had changed, the efficiency layer dropping slightly. "The board communications you flagged, the ones from 8 months ago, where Lydia positioned my opposition as personal. There are 2 board members who repeated that framing in external meetings. One of them is on the compensation committee." She paused. "They didn't just support the acquisition. They helped her construct the narrative." "I know," he said. "It's in the package Whitmore gave Purcell." "All of it?" "All of it I could document." Another silence. "You built this entire thing in 48 hours, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation, and it wasn't quite admiration. It was something more thoughtful than both. The observation of a person who runs organizations and understands what 48 hours represents when someone uses them with precision. "I had Diane and Whitmore," he said. "I didn't build it alone. You knew you'd be arrested tonight. I thought it was likely, and you went in anyway. The arrest was useful," he said. "It put me in a room with Briggs where I could lay out the 3-package system on the record, in a formal context, before anyone had a chance to complicate the story." He paused. "If I'd walked out of that building without being arrested, Lydia's lawyer would have had 12 hours to construct an alternative version. The arrest gave us the transcript first." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might be done. Then, "Why didn't you tell me about the 3 packages, about Whitmore's role tonight, all of it?" He turned his glass of water slowly on the table. He'd been expecting this question. He'd been sitting with the answer since she'd walked out of his apartment the previous evening. "Because if I'd told you," he said, "you would have tried to protect me from the parts that carried risk. And the parts that carried risk were the parts that made it work." He paused. "I wasn't keeping you out of it. I was keeping you out of the specific position where your instinct to act on what you owe me would have gotten in the way of the outcome." A long silence. "That's a very precise way of describing how you managed me," Serena said. "Yes," he said. "It is. I don't love that. I know. But I understand it," she said, "which is more irritating, honestly." He almost smiled. "Get some sleep," he said. The board is going to want a statement in the morning, and you'll want to be the one who controls the first version. I know how to handle boards, Mason. I know you do. He hung up. He sat for another few minutes at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet in the specific way that apartments are quiet at 3 a.m. Not silent, but settled. The building's own sounds reduced to their baseline. The refrigerator. Distant traffic. The specific creak of the floor near the bathroom that he'd never gotten fixed because it had become familiar enough to be almost comforting. He went to bed and slept for 4 hours, which was more than he'd expected. He picked up Ellie from Mrs. Callahan's at 8:15. Ellie had eaten breakfast, eggs and toast, she reported, and Mrs. Callahan had let her watch a nature documentary about penguins, and was in a good mood that Mason was careful not to disturb with the kind of adult seriousness that 8-year-olds can read even when adults think they're hiding it. In the truck, Ellie said, "Did you finish your work stuff?" "Most of it," he said. "Is the rest going to take a long time?" "Probably a few more days." She seemed to accept this. Then, "Is it the job?" "Some of it." "The job with the important people?" "Yes." She looked out the window. They were on Harbor Street, the morning running normally around them. The fish market opening, the coffee shop with its line already out the door, a woman walking a dog that was deeply unhappy about the pace. "Sophia says her dad got a new job last year," Ellie said, "and for a while he was kind of stressed and they didn't see him much, and then it got better and now he coaches her soccer team." Mason processed this. "Is that right?" "I'm just saying." She still had her eyes on the window. "It's okay if it takes a while." He looked at her profile. The slightly too big yellow jacket, the braid from last night now completely undone, her hair loose around her shoulders because she'd lost the elastic somewhere in Mrs. Callahan's guest room. "Thanks," he said. "You're welcome," she said, with the confidence of someone who knew the comment had landed. The emergency board meeting was called for 10 a.m. Mason knew about it because Serena had texted him at 7:30. Board called an emergency session. Lydia's supporters requested it. They want to discuss the security incident and my response. Then, 60 seconds later, "They don't know yet what I'm bringing." He got to Aurelius at 9:40. The lobby felt different in the daylight. Restored to its glass and steel composure, the events of the previous night absorbed into the building's indifferent architecture with no visible trace except for a slight scuff mark on the corridor wall near the north stairwell where one of the officers had caught a door edge. The receptionist, the same woman who'd watched Cavett dismiss him 4 days ago, looked up when he came through the entrance. This time, she held his gaze. "Mr. Rourke," she said, and there was something in it, not apology, but acknowledgement. The small adjustment that people make when the version of events they'd accepted has been replaced by a different one. "Good morning," he said. Whitmore was already upstairs in a conference room adjacent to the boardroom with a laptop and 2 printed copies of the full evidence package, coordinating with Purcell's office by phone. Diane Reyes had sent a final supplementary report at 6 a.m. She didn't sleep during active investigations, a fact Mason had forgotten and was reminded of by the timestamp, that added 3 additional wire transfer records that hadn't been in the preliminary material. "The 2 Route 12 contractors gave partial statements this morning," Whitmore said when Mason came in. "They're not giving Lydia, but they confirmed the Meridian connection and that they received instructions through the Verano routing structure. Combined with the phone records, it's enough." "Has Purcell frozen the accounts?" "Lydia's personal accounts, yes. Verano Partners has been flagged for emergency asset hold pending investigation. Meridian Capital Partners is fighting the flag through counsel, but they won't win it before the board meeting." Mason nodded. He poured himself a coffee from the carafe on the conference table. Real coffee, not the interrogation room variety, and stood looking out the window at the harbor. "There's one more thing," Whitmore said. He was looking at his laptop. The 2 board members who supported the acquisition, Garrett Falk and Rebecca Morrow. Diane found calendar entries from 8 months ago showing private meetings with Lydia in locations outside Aurelius. Both meetings were on days when Serena was traveling. Both were held at a private club registered to an entity that is— He paused, looking at the screen. "A subsidiary of the same Luxembourg holding company that owns Meridian." Mason turned from the window. "They were in it from the beginning," he said. "At minimum, they were informed," Whitmore said. "Whether they knew the full scope of what Lydia was planning, the break line, the threat to the child, that's harder to establish. But the financial coordination is documentable." Serena needs to know before she walks into that room. I called her at 8, Whitmore said. She knows. The boardroom at Aurelia Systems occupied the southeast corner of the executive floor with a wall of harbor-facing windows that on clear mornings filled the space with the kind of flat coastal light that made everything look either very clean or very exposed, depending on what you'd brought into the room with you. Mason stood outside it at 9:58 and watched through the glass panel beside the door. 8 board members were already seated. Gerald Cavett, not a board member but apparently invited as a senior executive, was at the far end with a yellow legal pad and an expression that suggested he believed this meeting was going to go a certain way. Garrett Falk, silver-haired and deliberate, was speaking quietly with the woman beside him. Rebecca Morrow was on her phone. At 10:02, Serena walked into the boardroom. She was followed by Carl Whitmore and a woman Mason recognized as Aurelius's outside legal counsel. And then, after a brief pause in the doorway, by Mason himself. Cavett looked up when Mason came in. Something moved across his face. A recalibration, the expression of a man who has committed to a version of events and is now processing that the version may not hold. Mason sat in a chair along the wall, not at the table. Observer position. He wasn't here as a board member or an executive or even formally as a consultant. He was here because Serena had asked him to be, and because his presence would communicate certain things more efficiently than words. Falk spoke first. "We called this meeting," he said, his voice measured and positioned for authority, "because of serious concerns about the events at this facility last night, and about the role of an outside individual who appears to have had unauthorized access to building systems, and Garrett." Serena's voice was quiet. The room went quiet with it in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the person speaking has decided they are done being patient. "I'm going to stop you there." She nodded to Whitmore, who opened his laptop and connected it to the room's display system. What appeared on the screens was not a presentation. It was documentation, direct, structured, in the plain language of financial records and communication logs and timestamped security data. Whitmore walked the room through it methodically, the way former federal agents walk through evidence, without emotional loading, without editorial, letting the structure speak for itself. The wire transfers, the Verano Partners structure, the Meridian connection, the calendar entries showing Falk and Morrow's private meetings, the body camera footage from the previous night, Lydia in the corridor, her voice clear on the audio, describing the location of disabled systems with knowledge that had never been publicly disclosed, the 3-package mechanism, and the Route 12 contractors. When Whitmore finished, the room had a quality to it that Mason had experienced before in other contexts. The quality of a space where something that had been constructed over a long time has just been taken apart publicly and efficiently, and everyone present is now managing the specific discomfort of having to decide what to do with that. Rebecca Morrow's phone was face down on the table. Garrett Falk was looking at a point in the middle distance. Cavett's legal pad was untouched. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a formal investigation this morning," Serena said. "The acquisition proposal from Meridian Capital Partners is suspended effective immediately under my authority as CEO, pending the outcome of that investigation. I'm also calling for an independent audit of all board communications and external relationships going back 24 months. Falk looked up. "You don't have unilateral authority to—" "The board charter gives the CEO authority to suspend any pending transaction during an active federal investigation involving parties to that transaction," Serena said. "Our outside counsel confirmed the language at 7 a.m. If you'd like, Rebecca can read it aloud. She was on the drafting committee for that clause." A pause. 3 years ago. Morrow said nothing. "Lydia Vane has been removed from her position and is in police custody," Serena continued. "2 board members whose external relationships represent a material conflict of interest will be asked to recuse themselves from all votes pending investigation. Those members know who they are." Falk's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who had spent a career in rooms like this one winning arguments, and Mason could see him calculating whether there was a play left. The calculation appeared to come up empty. "This meeting is adjourned," Serena said. People filed out. Cavett was one of the last. He stopped near the door, and for a moment it looked like he would say something. He looked at Serena, and then his gaze moved briefly to Mason along the wall. Mason looked back at him. Cavett left without speaking. Whitmore packed up his laptop and gave Serena a brief nod that contained several things: professional respect, the acknowledgement of a complicated morning competently handled, and the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent 20 years at the FBI and had learned to take that satisfaction where it appeared and not expect it too often. He shook Mason's hand on the way out. "Good work," he said, which was Whitmore's version of a speech. The boardroom emptied until it was just Mason and Serena. She was standing at the window looking out at the harbor. The morning light was doing the exposed version of things, making the table surface gleam, catching the grain of the wood, not sparing anything. She had a hand on the back of one of the board chairs, not holding it for support, just resting there. Mason moved to stand beside her. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Falk and Morrow," she said. "I hired Falk myself. He'd known me for 12 years before he joined the board." She said it with the measured distance of someone who has already processed the worst of it and is now in the aftermath, where what's left is not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific fatigue of having been wrong about people you trusted and knowing the wrongness was partly your own. "The access you gave people," Mason said. "That's not a flaw. That's why you built what you built." She turned her head slightly. "That sounds like something people say." "It is something people say," he said. "It's also true." She was quiet for a moment. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I decided last night while you were in that interrogation room." She turned from the window to face him. "I'm going to make a public statement about what Aurelius did to you on the morning you came in for the interview, about what Cavett did in the lobby. I want it on record, formally, publicly, that the company failed to treat a qualified candidate with basic dignity, and that the decision to reject you without an interview was wrong." Mason was quiet. "I'm not asking your permission," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know before it goes out." "All right," he said, "and I want to offer you the Director of Emergency Operations position again." He looked at her. "I know what you said before," she continued. "I know you want to earn it without it being connected to everything that happened, and I respect that. So here's what I'm proposing. A panel, independent of me, independent of the board, external hiring professionals with full access to the candidate pool. You apply through the same process as anyone else. No favor, no debt, no consideration for anything that happened this week, except to the extent that your performance this week is itself evidence of your capabilities, which any reasonable evaluator would consider." Mason looked back at the harbor. "That's a fair offer," he said. "It's the right offer," she said. "There's a difference." He almost said something about the difference. Then he decided against it. "I'll apply," he said. She nodded. "One condition," he added. She waited. "Cavett doesn't sit on the panel, not as a member, not as an observer." Serena held his gaze. "Done," she said, without hesitation and without making a performance of it. The directness of someone who had already made the same decision and was glad to have it confirmed. They left the boardroom together, and as they walked out into the corridor, the building was running its mid-morning version of itself around them. People moving with purpose, bones, and conversations, and the ambient productive noise of an organization that had not stopped functioning despite the week it had just had. There was something both banal and specifically reassuring about that, Mason thought. The way institutions, good ones anyway, kept running. Not because the people in them were indestructible, but because the structure held when the people needed it to. He would have to write up his 48-hour consulting report. He would have to give a formal statement to Purcell's office. He would have to follow up with Diane, who had sent him 3 messages since 6 a.m. that he hadn't answered yet. He had a night shift at the repair facility on Friday that he needed to either cover or reschedule. He needed to get Ellie a new elastic for her hair because she went through them at a rate that seemed physically improbable. He needed to call his sister in Portland, who had left 2 voicemails this week that he hadn't returned. Normal things. The logistics of a life that kept going. He was almost to the elevator when Serena said his name. He turned. She was standing a few feet behind him, and she had an expression that he had not seen on her before. Not the competent CEO expression. Not the frightened but functional expression from the drainage channel. Not the controlled fury expression from the boardroom. Something more unguarded than any of those. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the job, not for any of the—" She stopped, started again. "Thank you for not walking away when the photograph arrived. Most people would have walked away. Mason thought about the moment he'd seen the photograph. The yellow jacket, the 6 words, the cold thing that had settled in his chest and then resolved into something else. Not calm, not certainty, but direction. I had a daughter at Mrs. Callahan's, he said. There wasn't a version of walking away that actually got us somewhere safe. That's practical, she said. It's the truth. She nodded slowly. The expression hadn't changed. Still that unguarded thing, honest in a way that seemed to cost her something, though she was paying it without complaint. I'll see you at the panel, she said. You won't be at the panel, he said. That was your condition. I know. There was something in her voice that was close to dry humor, but warmer than that. I'll see you before the panel. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, he passed the reception desk. The same woman, same desk. She looked up, and this time the small journey her expression made was different from the one 4 days ago. Not the polished hospitality assessment, not the recalibration of this morning, just a person looking at another person. Have a good day, she said. You too, he said. He walked out into the coastal morning. The air was clean after the rain system had moved on, and the harbor was doing its silver-gray thing in the mid-morning light. His truck was in the visitor lot where he'd left it the night before. He'd ridden with Briggs and hadn't gone back for it. It had a parking citation on the windshield, which he looked at and then put in his jacket pocket with the dead body camera, because both of them were problems that existed at a manageable scale and could be addressed in sequence. He sat in the truck for a moment. He wasn't thinking about the boardroom or Lydia or the federal investigation or the panel that was coming. He was thinking about a specific moment 2 days ago in Mrs. Callahan's driveway, Ellie with her backpack saying, "Is it dangerous?" and him saying, "The work stuff." No. And the trust she'd extended on the back of that, not because she believed him entirely, but because she'd decided to. He owed her something for that. Not an explanation, not yet. Just the ongoing work of being the person she'd trusted him to be. He started the truck. He had time before he needed to be anywhere. He drove to the diner on Harbor Street because it was 11 a.m. and he hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and bad decisions at crucial moments were frequently the result of bad logistics at routine ones. He'd learned that a long time ago and kept relearning it. He got a table by the window. He ordered eggs and toast and real coffee, and he sat there in the ordinary daylight of a Thursday morning in Harwick. And he looked at the harbor, and he felt tired in the specific way that comes after something is finished, and before the next thing has fully begun, the hinge moment that is neither crisis nor resolution, but simply the space between them where a person can sit and eat eggs and let their nervous system catch up to the fact that the emergency is over. His phone was on the table. He turned it face down. He ate his breakfast. The panel convened 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in a rented conference room at a neutral location, a law firm on Meridian Street, 2 floors above the coffee shop where Mason had bought bad coffee on the morning of his first interview and drunk it in his truck in the parking lot of Aurelius Systems while wearing a burgundy tie he'd bought for a funeral. He wore a different tie this time, navy blue, which Ellie had selected from the 2 options he'd held up for her inspection the previous evening. She'd pointed at it without looking up from her book and said that one with the confidence of someone who understood aesthetics instinctively and didn't need to make a production of it. He'd taken her word for it. There were 5 panelists. None of them were Aurelius employees. The firm had brought in a former operations director from the federal emergency management sector, a crisis systems architect who'd spent 15 years building response frameworks for Fortune 100 companies, 2 independent HR professionals, and a retired Coast Guard commander named Adkins, who had a handshake like a structural component and the specific quality of attention that comes from decades of making fast decisions in bad weather. Serena was not present. She had kept her word on that without making a virtue of keeping it, which Mason had noted and appreciated. The session ran 3 hours and 20 minutes. They did not ask him about Lydia Vane. They did not ask him about the drainage channel or the aluminum case, or the night he'd walked into a building with 3 armed men and a case full of blank paper. Those events were public record by now. The federal investigation had generated enough press coverage that the broad outlines of the week were known to anyone who'd been following the defense technology news cycle. But the panel had apparently decided that what Mason had done under pressure was less relevant than what he understood about building systems that didn't require heroics. That was the right call, and he respected them for it. What they asked him was harder. The crisis systems architect, a compact woman named Okafor, who asked questions with the efficiency of someone billing by the hour and genuinely not wasting time, leaned forward about 40 minutes in and said, "Walk me through the specific failure you'd prioritize fixing at Aurelius, not the people, the architecture." Mason had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks, in the spaces between the FBI interviews and the formal consulting report and the 3 separate depositions and the school pickup and the dinners and the ordinary machinery of a life that had not paused for any of it. "The conflict of interest problem," he said. "In any crisis, the people responsible for managing the emergency are almost always the same people whose decisions contributed to the conditions that created it. That's true in corporate security, it's true in government emergency response, it's true in military operations. The person in charge of the response has an interest in how the investigation comes out." He paused. At Aurelius, Serena Halstead couldn't investigate the threat to her own life without going through systems controlled by the person who was threatening her life. That's not a Lydia Vane problem. That's a structural problem. "How do you fix it?" Okafor asked. "You build an emergency response function that operates independently of the executive chain. It reports to the board through a channel that isn't accessible to any single executive, including the CEO. Crisis Investigation Authority gets separated from Crisis Management Authority. The same person can't run both simultaneously. And you create a whistleblower pathway that's genuinely protected, not theoretically protected, one that routes to an external receiver rather than an internal compliance officer who answers to the people being reported on." The Coast Guard commander Adkins said, "You'd remove the CEO from the crisis response chain?" "Not remove. Inform. The CEO gets real-time information and has input on response decisions. But the CEO doesn't control the investigation into the crisis, and the CEO doesn't control the security systems that might be used as evidence." He looked at Adkins steadily. "The commanding officer of a vessel doesn't investigate their own collision. Someone else does that." Adkins nodded slowly, not agreeing necessarily, but registering that the logic was sound. The session went on. They pushed him on budget, on implementation timelines, on how he'd handle resistance from senior executives who didn't want an independent function with access to their communications. He answered all of it directly, and where he didn't have a complete answer, he said so and described how he would develop one, which was more useful than a complete answer would have been because it showed them how he thought rather than what he'd memorized. At one point, the former federal emergency director, a careful man named Pryor, who spoke slowly and meant everything he said, looked at Mason's resume and said, "There's a significant gap between your military service and your current work. Can you tell me about that?" Mason had been expecting this question since the panel began. "My wife died," he said. "I had an 8-year-old daughter and no one to share the work with, and the work was the kind that didn't leave room for the other kind. So I made a choice." He paused. "I don't regret the choice. I'd make it again. But it meant I spent 5 years doing work that was below my training level, and I'm aware that looks like a gap." "Does it bother you?" Pryor asked. "The gap." Mason thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Sometimes," he said, "less than it used to." Pryor nodded and moved on. When it was done, the panel thanked him and said he'd hear within a week. He shook hands with all 5 of them, collected his notebook, and took the elevator down to the street. He stood outside the law firm on Meridian Street in the late morning light and breathed the coastal air, which smelled of salt and the coffee shop below him, and faintly of diesel from the harbor. He felt something he didn't immediately name. Not relief. The outcome wasn't known yet. Not pride, because pride felt like the wrong category for something this tangled in luck and timing and other people's work and a whole week of events he wouldn't have chosen. Something quieter than either of those. The feeling of having done a thing correctly after a long time of not doing it, and of being the only one who could really measure that, and finding the measurement acceptable. He went to pick up Ellie. She was in the art room when he arrived, which was allowed on the 2 days a week the after-school program ran late. She was working on something with blue paint that had migrated from the paper to her forearms in a way that suggested full commitment to the project. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Good, I think." "Did you talk a lot?" 3 hours. She looked impressed in the involuntary way children look impressed when they hear an adult has done something that sounds objectively difficult. "What did you talk about?" "Systems," he said. Like computer systems? More like ways of organizing how people respond when something goes wrong. She considered this with the seriousness it apparently warranted. Then she turned back to her painting. That sounds like something you'd be good at, she said, as a statement of established fact, and went back to the blue. He waited. The call came 6 days later, on a Monday afternoon, while Mason was at the repair facility doing a calibration check on an industrial compressor that had been giving the night crew trouble. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He finished the calibration check. The machine didn't care about timing, and the reading mattered. And then stepped into the corridor and answered. It was Pryor. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "the panel voted unanimously to recommend you for the Director of Emergency Operations position at Aurelius Systems. The recommendation has been forwarded to the board for formal approval. Given the current board composition and Serena Halstead's endorsement of the panel process, approval is—" A brief pause, the precision of a man who did not make guarantees, expected. Mason leaned against the corridor wall. The compressor behind him was ticking as it settled. "Thank you," he said. "You made it straightforward," Pryor said. "That's not as common as it should be." Mason thanked him again and hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment. From the main floor came the noise of the facility doing its evening thing, pneumatic tools, the low grinding of something being machined, two technicians arguing cheerfully about a torque specification. The particular sound of work being done by people who knew what they were doing. He'd spent 5 years in this world. Not because it was what he'd planned and not because it was beneath him. Work was work, and he'd never been the kind of person who believed that the dignity of a job diminished with its pay grade. But because it was what had been possible at the time, and he'd made it enough, and it had in its own way been enough. He went back to the compressor and finished the shift. He called Serena that evening. She answered before the second ring. "Pryor called me," she said before he could say anything. "I know. I had to physically stop myself from calling you for 6 days. I noticed," he said. She had sent him exactly 2 texts in 6 days, both about unrelated Aurelius administrative matters, and both so carefully neutral in tone that they were themselves a kind of communication. "Mason." "Yes." "Congratulations," she said, and the word had nothing performed in it, just the plain weight of someone who was genuinely glad about a thing and saying so. "Thank you," he said, "for the panel, for the way you set it up. You earned it." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm thanking you, for making it possible to know that." A brief silence. "Dinner?" she said. "Not a celebration, just dinner. You, me, and Ellie, if she wants to come. There's a place on the harbor that does a fish chowder that's worth knowing about." "Ellie will want to come," Mason said. "She's been asking about you." A pause. "She has?" "She asked if you were the woman from the car. I said yes. She asked if you were okay." He paused. "I told her you were." Another silence, a different quality to this one. "Tell her yes," Serena said quietly. "Tell her I'm okay." They went on a Wednesday. The restaurant was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and would be there for 30 more. Wood tables, low light, a chalkboard menu that changed with the catch, fishing floats hanging from the ceiling in a way that had started as decoration and become simply part of the room's identity. Serena was already there when they arrived, which Mason had expected, and she stood when they came in, which Ellie noticed. "You stood up," Ellie said. "That's what you do when people arrive," Serena said. "Some people don't," Ellie said. Then, apparently satisfied with this exchange, she pulled out a chair and sat down and picked up the menu. Mason caught Serena's eye. She looked like someone trying not to smile and deciding there was no particular reason not to. The dinner was 2 hours. Ellie ate 2 bowls of chowder, the second one slightly smaller, requested with the confidence of someone who understood how to work a negotiation, and talked extensively about the Penguin documentary, the ecosystem project, which was now complete and had received, she reported with careful modesty, a very good grade. She asked Serena what her job was, and when Serena explained it, Ellie said, "Like a principal, but for a whole company?" And Serena said that was actually a very accurate description, and Ellie said, "That sounds stressful," with the directness that 8-year-olds deploy without understanding that it's a gift. "It can be," Serena said. "Your dad is going to help make it less stressful." Ellie looked at Mason. "Because of the systems." "Because of the systems," he confirmed. She nodded as if this had been the expected answer and went back to her chowder. Walking back to the truck afterward, Ellie between them on the harbor sidewalk, Mason became aware of something that he registered carefully and without making too much of it, the specific ordinariness of the moment, the way it didn't require anything. No performance, no management of impressions, no calculation about what came next. Just a harbor street on a Wednesday evening, the water visible between the buildings, the sound of the fish market closing up for the night. A small person in a yellow jacket walking slightly ahead because that was the age she was at, practicing at the independence she was growing toward. There would be complications ahead. He knew that in the abstract way you know things when you're standing in a good moment, not as a warning, just as information. The job would be hard. The federal investigation into Lydia and Meridian would run for months and require ongoing cooperation from both Mason and Serena. The two compromised board members had engaged their own legal counsel, which meant depositions and hearings that would pull at the margins of everyone's time. Ellie would have questions eventually. About Serena, about what she meant, about how the geometry of their life was changing. And those questions would deserve honest answers that Mason was not yet sure how to give. None of that was tonight. Ellie stopped at the corner and looked back at them. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked. Mason looked at Serena. "It's a Wednesday," he said. "So?" Ellie said. "Ice cream's a weekend thing." "That's not a rule," Ellie said. "That's just something you say." Serena made a sound that was definitely a laugh, brief and genuine, and looked away toward the harbor. Mason looked at his daughter, who was standing on the corner with her hands in her jacket pockets, and a braid that was already coming undone, and an expression of someone who understood that she had made a strong argument and was confident in it. "Yeah," he said. "All right." They found an ice cream place 2 blocks down that was still open, and that had, according to the hand-lettered sign in the window, 23 flavors, of which Ellie required a full survey before selecting the one she'd probably intended to get from the beginning. Mason got coffee. Serena got something with mango that she said she was uncertain about, and then finished completely. It was not a significant evening by any external measure. There was no moment that would read dramatically in the retelling. It was simply 3 people eating ice cream on a Wednesday in a coastal town, and the unremarkable texture of it was, Mason thought, the actual point. He had spent 12 years in the Navy doing things that mattered in ways that were large and verifiable and sometimes classified. He had spent 5 years after that doing things that mattered in ways that were small and daily and invisible to anyone except one small person who noticed everything. Somewhere in the handoff between those 2 lives, he had lost the thread of something he hadn't known to call by name until recently. The thread was this, that the significant moments are rarely the ones that announce themselves. The crash in the channel, the boardroom, the interrogation room at 2 a.m. Those were the events that would be in the record, that Purcell's investigation would cite in its documentation, that would appear in whatever press coverage eventually came out of the Aurelia story. But they were not the moments that had actually determined anything about who Mason Rourke was or was becoming. The moments that determined that were the ones where nobody was watching and there was no particular reason to do the right thing, except that it was the right thing. The moment on Route 9 when he'd seen the Escalade go over the barrier and had stopped without deciding to stop. The moment he'd told Serena he wouldn't take the job as a favor. The moment with Ellie in the truck. Is it dangerous? Not late? Where he'd been honest at the scale that was possible and had earned, without deserving it automatically, the trust she extended. A person's character isn't what they do when the stakes are high enough to force the issue. It's what they do when the choice is genuinely free, when stopping or not stopping makes a difference to someone else but not necessarily to them, when walking away is a reasonable option and continuing costs something real. Mason had stopped on Route 9 because stopping was who he was. Not because he'd been trained to, though he had been. Not because he'd calculated the outcome, though he'd done that in the 3 seconds after the vehicle went over the barrier. Because at the core of however he'd ended up assembled, stopping for people who needed stopping for was simply what he did. The same way Ellie stopped to pick up interesting rocks from parking lots. The same way his wife had remembered every birthday of everyone she'd ever met. Not because it was strategic, just because it was the shape of them. He had never thought of that as a strength. For years he'd thought of it as a liability, the thing that had cost him interviews and sleep, and the particular peace of mind that comes from not engaging. He was revising that assessment. Ellie finished her ice cream and looked at the cup with the expression of someone who has consumed a thing completely and is making peace with that fact. "We should do this again," she said, not to Mason specifically, to both of them. Serena looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "We should." Mason's first day at Aurelia Systems was a Monday in the third week of October, 6 weeks after the panel and 8 weeks after a rain-soaked morning on Route 9 that had started as the worst day of his year and turned into something he still didn't have the right word for. He had an office on the 4th floor, not the executive floor, by his own request. He wanted the emergency operations function to be structurally visible to the whole organization, not housed among the C-suite in a way that implied it existed to serve leadership rather than the company. The facilities team had looked mildly confused by the request. He'd explained the reasoning once, and they'd complied. His first act as director was to post a single line on the department's internal communication board. Not a mission statement. Not a set of values, which always sounded like they'd been written by a committee that had been in a room too long. Just one sentence, 8 words. When everyone else keeps driving, be the one who stops. He didn't explain it. He figured the people who needed to understand it would, and the people who didn't would ask, and the asking would be its own kind of orientation. His second act was to schedule individual meetings with every member of the security and facilities team, from the shift supervisors to the overnight maintenance staff who'd been in the building the night of the power failure and had seen things that nobody had formally asked them about yet. He spent 2 weeks in those conversations. He took notes by hand. He asked questions more than he answered them, because he'd learned a long time ago that the most useful information in any organization lives in the people who are present when things go wrong and are not usually in the room when decisions get made. What he found was what he'd expected to find. Good people working with bad systems, accommodating gaps that had been there so long they'd become invisible, covering for each other in the quiet, persistent way that frontline workers cover when they trust their colleagues and don't trust the structure. He started there. The whistleblower channel was the first thing he built. An external receiver, a law firm with no other Aurelius relationship, that collected reports directly, without any internal routing, encrypted and time-stamped and accessible only through a review process that required 2 external parties and could not be intercepted by any Aurelius executive. He presented the architecture to the board at his first formal report. 3 members asked good questions. One asked a question that was really an objection. Mason answered the objection directly and then asked the board member whether they would like their specific concern noted in the record of the meeting. The concern was not noted. The system was approved. He also established a protocol requiring that any crisis response involving potential criminal activity trigger an automatic external notification to an independent investigator, separate from law enforcement, separate from in-house counsel, within the first 6 hours. He called it the independence requirement, because naming things plainly was how you prevented people from finding creative interpretations of what they meant. Serena reviewed everything he built, because that was her right, and because her operational knowledge of Aurelius was something Mason would have been foolish to ignore. They disagreed about 3 things over the first 2 months. 2 of those disagreements Mason won, because the evidence supported his position, and Serena was, whatever else she was, someone who followed evidence when it led somewhere she hadn't expected. One of those disagreements he lost, because she was right, and he had the specific good sense to say so directly rather than conceding through silence. Working with her was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the kind of executive relationship that lived in scheduled meetings and formal communications, the particular professional distance of a CEO and a director who had a complicated personal history and were navigating it with careful courtesy. What he found instead was something more functional and less careful than that. Someone who challenged his frameworks, pushed back on his timelines, occasionally sent him messages at 11 p.m. about things she'd thought of, in the way that people send messages when they trust the other person to engage rather than to manage their reaction. It was not easy. It was something better than easy. Ellie met Serena properly, outside of the dinner, in the daylight, at the Saturday Farmers Market on Harbor Street, in early November. Mason had not arranged it deliberately. They'd simply appeared at the same stall at the same time, which in a town the size of Harwick was inevitable once both parties were regular attendees. Serena was buying apples. Ellie was conducting a very serious evaluation of a specific jar of honey that she wanted Mason to buy. The two of them ended up side by side at the honey display for 4 minutes, during which Ellie explained, without prompting, the difference between wildflower honey and clover honey as she understood it from a video she'd watched. And Serena listened with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than performing interest, and offered her own observation about a third variety that Ellie had not yet tried. Mason stood to the side and let it happen. He was aware, watching them, of something he hadn't expected to feel. Not happiness exactly, which was a category he'd become suspicious of in the years since his wife died. Aware that it was too simple a word for the complicated thing it was supposed to describe. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a shape he'd forgotten was possible. A morning at a market with honey and apples and no emergency and nowhere urgent to be, and a small person in a yellow jacket building a taxonomy of sweetness, with a woman who had, over the past several months, become something he didn't have a clean word for. Not because they'd declared anything. They hadn't. They'd had coffee twice and dinner 4 times and one long conversation in Mason's truck on the Harbor Road that had started about the Aurelius restructuring and ended somewhere else entirely. And at the end of it, Serena had looked at him for a moment in the particular way of someone deciding whether to say something, and had then said goodnight and gotten out of the truck, and he had driven home and stood in his kitchen for a while, and that had been its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked yet. What they had was not a clean story. It was 2 people who had met in a drainage channel and a damaged car and a building with the power cut, who had each spent time in their separate lives becoming whoever they were, and who were now, cautiously, without making a large announcement about it, beginning to find that whoever they were might be compatible in the specific way that mattered. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, the most honest version of how this kind of thing worked, which was not through declarations but through ordinary accumulation, coffee and dinners and arguments and honey discussions at farmers' markets and evenings when nobody needed rescuing and nobody was performing anything. 1 year after the crash on Route 9, Mason drove them both out to the highway. It had been his idea, which surprised him a little when he had it. He wasn't a person who marked anniversaries with ceremony, but Ellie had asked him once, months later, casually, the way she asked things, what had happened on that road before he was late to his interview, and he'd told her a shortened version, and she'd said she wanted to see the place. And so there was that. They went on a Saturday morning, the 3 of them in Mason's truck. Ellie was in the back seat with a book she wasn't reading, watching the coastal scenery in the particular way she watched things when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided to say yet. The spot on Route 9 was easy to find. Aurelius had installed an emergency response station there 3 months after the incident. A weatherproof cabinet with first aid materials, a flotation device, a direct connect phone to emergency services. Small. Practical. Exactly the kind of thing that the previous version of Aurelius under the previous structure would never have thought to do. They stood at the guardrail, repaired now, new steel, and looked down at the drainage channel, which was running low in the dry fall weather, the water clear enough to see the rocky bed. "That's where the car went?" Ellie asked. "Yes," Mason said. She looked at it for a while. "And you just jumped in?" "I didn't really think about it in those terms." "What terms did you think about it in?" He looked down at the channel. The channel looked different in fair weather, smaller, more manageable, the rushing brown water of that morning replaced by something quiet and ordinary. "There was a person in the car," he said. "That's mostly what I thought about." Ellie accepted this and appeared to find it satisfactory. Serena was looking at the emergency response cabinet, specifically at the small placard on its face that said Aurelius Systems Community Safety Initiative and had an emergency number and an installation date. "You know what's strange," she said. "You stopping here cost you the interview that was supposed to change your life. And now you're the one who put this here." She looked at Mason. "That's a strange loop." "Yes," he said. "Does it feel like anything, standing here?" He thought about it. The question deserved an honest answer, not a clean one. "It feels like a Tuesday that turned into something else," he said. "Most things do, I think. Most of the stuff that actually changes anything doesn't announce itself first." Serena looked at him. She had the harbor-facing window expression from her office, the one that meant she was sitting with something real rather than processing it toward a conclusion. "You told me once," she said, "that stopping didn't cost you the life you'd expected, that it changed your life into something you hadn't expected." "Yes." Do you still think that? He looked at Ellie, who had walked several steps ahead along the guardrail and was crouching to look at something in the gravel, some rock or piece of debris that had caught her attention in the way everything caught her attention when she was genuinely looking. The yellow jacket, the braid, the absolute focus of a child engaged with something small and found. He looked at Serena beside him. "Yes," he said, "more than I did when I said it." She took his hand, not dramatically, just reached over and took it, the way you take something you've decided you're allowed to have. Her hand was cold from the fall air. He closed his fingers around it. Ellie stood up from her crouch, holding a piece of quartz that was apparently worth noting, and looked back at them. She registered the hand situation with the expression of someone who had expected this development and was prepared to be dignified about it. Then she turned and walked further along the guardrail, holding her rock. Mason and Serena stood at the edge of Route 9 in the October light and said nothing, which didn't need filling. He had spent years believing that the most important chapter of his life was already over, that the part of him which had been capable of things that mattered had been given to a different life, the 12 years in service. The missions that had been real and consequential and were now sealed away in the past with the classification markings and the names of people he'd served with and the particular compressed intensity of work that is never entirely safe. He understood now that this belief had been a way of protecting himself from the difficulty of starting over. If the important chapter was behind him, he didn't have to attempt the next one. He could do the work in front of him, the good honest work of raising a daughter and maintaining compressors and keeping the bills paid, and hold the belief that nothing ahead could matter as much as what had already passed. He had been wrong about that. Not entirely wrong. The past had been real, and it had made him what he was. And he wouldn't trade any of it, not even the worst of it. But the belief that it was the best he had was wrong, and the wrongness of it had cost him years of keeping himself at a careful distance from the possibility of anything that mattered as much. The crash on Route 9 had not been the thing that corrected this. It had been the catalyst, the event that started the sequence. But the correction had happened in pieces, slowly, the way real corrections happen. In the conversations and the disagreements and the dinners and the ordinary accumulation of evidence that the future was worth inhabiting with the same seriousness he'd brought to the past. He was 40 years old. He had a daughter who was becoming someone extraordinary in the patient, incremental way that people become themselves, and a job that was harder and more interesting than anything he'd done in 5 years. And a woman standing beside him on a coastal road who had been almost killed on this same road a year ago, and who was, in her own complicated and non-perfect way, the most honest person he'd encountered in a long time. That was not a small life. That was, in fact, everything. Inside the Aurelius Emergency Training Center, built in the new year, operational by spring, staffed by the people Mason had spent 2 months getting to know individually before he'd designed anything. His first rule was written above the entrance in plain black letters on a white background, because plain was the right register for something you needed people to actually read rather than admire. When everyone else keeps driving, be the one who stops. It was not a complicated instruction. It did not require a training module or an interpretation guide. The people who came through that entrance knew what it meant, or they learned, because the knowing and the learning were both equally valid starting points. And what mattered was not where you began, but what you did when the moment actually arrived. Ellie had asked him once, on the drive home from one of her early visits to his office, what the sign meant. He told her. She'd been quiet for a while, looking out the window, doing the processing that she did when something required it. Then she'd said, "Is that about the car?" "Partly," he said. "What else is it about?" He'd thought about it. The honest answer was also the simple one. "It's about most things," he said. She'd nodded, apparently satisfied, and gone back to the window. The harbor had been doing its evening thing outside. The light going flat and silver, the fishing boats running their patterns, the town settling into the end of a day that had been like most days, ordinary and sufficient and full of small decisions that nobody would remember and that would nonetheless determine everything.